Smith chat. Sweet. And they're off. What's up, Agent Smith?
Hello?
Yo, dude.
Oh, hey. How are you doing?
How are you?
Can't complain.
I try to be
Can't
honest.
complain. Had some nice cabbage soup tonight. Very tasty.
Cool. I'm having rice, beans, corn, and Dave's Insanity hot sauce.
That's a colorful recipe.
Yeah. I go hard.
How is it?
Yeah, it's good. It's enough to make you cry and fill your belly. All right.
Well,
So, we got another week in sequence, which is a change of pace for us for the past few months. It's awesome. I'm glad that we're back in the saddle, so to speak. What's been going on this week? So, from what I've seen on Facebook and in some of the news, graduate students in the U.S., something about their funding. Since you've been a grad student, I guess that's probably close to home.
I hadn't heard about that.
Oh.
Did something happen?
Yeah, I think the House voted to cut the amount of tax breaks for grad students, so they're going to be struggling more. My impression was always that being a grad student is a very low income situation, and you're not like rolling in dough or anything. It's kind of like you squeeze by and you work your ass off, sort of deal. So that was kind of a questionable thing.
Yeah, it depends on what kind of grad student you are. I mean, if you're a master's student, then yeah, it can be expensive. If you're a PhD student, though, generally once you get into the PhD program, it's actually pretty cost efficient because generally they'll actually pay you to be a TA or RA, and they'll actually waive your tuition. So that's not that expensive if you can get that set up, if you can get a TA RA position in the PhD program. It's costly in terms of opportunity cost because it's not like RAs and TAs get paid a lot of money. But if your living arrangement is such that you can afford to live off of a TA salary, then you're not going to break the bank with tuition in a PhD program. So not necessarily as much of a problem there.
Oh, someone corrected me in the chat, actually. They gave details. Tuition waivers from universities will be taxed as income. That's the change. I didn't articulate it very well the first time, but that's what it is.
University what will be taxed as income?
Tuition waivers will be taxed as income.
Oh, well, that's exactly what I mentioned. Yeah, that's unfortunate. It's not like they have a lot of money, so yeah, I don't think I would like that much. Certainly, if I were still in graduate school. Yeah, they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel trying to pay for this corporate tax cut bill that they're working on. I'm assuming that this tax cut is a part of one of the proposed tax reform bills. I guess they could have passed it on its own. Again, I haven't heard of that, so I'm not sure. But it sounds like the sort of thing that they would try to do to try to put into the tax reform bill to try to pay for it. You know, they've got this whole laundry list of tax deductions that they're getting rid of or mitigating, so that they can generate revenue to offset the loss in revenue from cutting corporate taxes and cutting taxes on pass-through entities. So that's I'm more familiar with that. I did have an update on that. You know, the new thing on that was the Senate version of the bill came out. We talked a bit last time about the House version of the bill. I don't think I articulated that it was the House version. I think I just said it was the tax reform bill. That was the House version. This is the Senate version. And for anyone outside the United States who doesn't understand the significance of House version and Senate version, the United States Congress has two major houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And whenever Congress wants to pass a bill, both the House and the Senate have to agree on what the bill will look like. So generally, a proposed bill will be designed in the House, and then the Senate will come up with a version, and then the House and Senate will get together and negotiate on the two versions, and then agree on a common bill that they will then go and vote on. So we've seen the House's proposal. This is the Senate's proposal, and what they did is, well, for one, they lowered the tax deduction for corporate income taxes. Lowered. They put it down to 20%. I think it was more like 21 or 22% in the House version of the bill. And they also got rid of the controversial removal of, what was it, mortgage interest deductions, which is the principal revenue generator that was used in the House version of the bill. People who own expensive houses got a pretty decent sized deduction out of that, so removing it was unpopular. So the Senate version gets rid of that. So those people with mortgages will be pleased with the maintenance of that deduction. But instead, what they did was, what was it? Right, the individual tax cuts would be sunsetted. That was the principal offset there. And the individual tax cuts, which I don't think were really in the House version of the bill, I don't remember reading about them, but with the individual tax cuts, they maintained the 7 income brackets that are currently used by the IRS, and they reduce the tax rate for, I think, every bracket, or at least most of them. And that was something the House didn't do, if I'm remembering it correctly. But what they did is they said that, okay, we're going to do that, but we're going to rescind these tax cuts in 2025. And what that means is that the tax cuts will last until 2025, and then they'll automatically end. And the reason they did that is that there's a rule in Congress that changes to taxes will not, I hope I'm remembering this right, changes to taxes will not be permanent unless they, one, don't add more than $1.5 trillion to the deficit inside 10 years. And also, they can't add anything to the deficit after 10 years. So in order to meet that condition, they had to sunset the tax cuts, because otherwise the tax cuts would have just added too much to the deficit. These rules are also necessary because they allow a majority vote. Normally in the Senate, you need a 2/3 majority to pass legislation. But according to this rule, you can pass legislation with regard to the budget, which regards, again, taxes, tax revenue, that kind of thing. You can just have a majority vote for those things if the legislation in question meets those conditions. And since, the Senate is so evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, and the Democrats will almost certainly uniformly vote against the bill, the Republicans basically have to get the majority vote, because they'll never get it passed with the 2/3 majority requirement. So it was really a necessity to meet these conditions regarding limitations on how much the bill can add to the deficit. And sunsetting the tax cuts was pretty much the only way they could come up with to do that. It's kind of sneaky, because hypothetically 10 years from now, when the tax cuts end, whatever Congress exist at that time will be able to just vote on them again. They could just implement them again. They could just say, okay, these tax cuts are over, let's vote on some new ones, and just basically re-implement them. And that effectively would just ignore the deficit rule. And that's a little sneaky, but that's pretty much exactly the kind of budget strategy that Congress has implemented over much of its history. So it wouldn't be surprising, is what I'm getting at there. They also slipped in a removal of the individual mandate for health insurance. Part of Obamacare was that you have to buy health insurance on pain of a tax penalty. And they've slipped into the bill basically removing that. It's not actually removal. They're not actually removing the mandate, but what they did is they reduced the tax penalty for not having health insurance to $0. So effectively, they would remove it if this were to pass. So that's obviously controversial. The bill in general is controversial, but slipping in the Obamacare thing, that's kind of adding to the tension there. And then deficit hawks don't really like the sunsetting provision, or at least I don't think they do, because that's may or may not be implemented again in the future. So we'll see what happens there. But this is the Senate version of the bill, and that's kind of where it stands. It kind of has the same problems as the House bill in that it kind of throws a lot of goodies to corporations, but not doesn't really give much to small businesses or individuals or homeowners, etc. So it'll be a hard sell politically speaking in that way, and I'm not sure they'll be able to square that circle, given the divisions even within the Republican Party. So that's let's see. How did we get onto that? That came from something else.
The grad students' tuition waived.
Right.
Taxed.
Right. Yes. Yeah. That's so the only familiarity I have with that is the tax reform bill, and that's one of the little measures. I would imagine that's one of the revenue-generating measures that they're trying to include in that bill. The House version of the bill had a whole bunch of them. I think it had more than the Senate version even. With regard to education, the one I remember from the House version of the bill was a 1.5% tax on large endowments, or the return on large endowments, or something to that effect. It's a very small tax, and it only applies to very wealthy, basically the wealthiest universities in the U.S. that have, huge endowments. That they make huge amounts of money off the interest on those endowments. So the tax just applies to them. They'll probably be able to afford it. They probably won't like it, but they'll be able to afford it. It won't be a huge knock on them and their ability to provide education. But as far as taxing tuition waivers for grad students, that's really not going to generate much revenue. Mm-hmm. I don't know why they're picking on grad students. Maybe somebody had an RA they didn't like at some point. Let's see. We did have some questions, so let me kind of... What's going on in Saudi Arabia, arresting rival princes, making the president of Lebanon resign, like what? We actually talked about this last week, and I probably won't be able to give as good an answer as last week. But kind of the gist of last week's explanation was that, basically the Saudis are putting pressure on the Iranians. That's as far as the Lebanon issue goes. That's could be the next site of a proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's not really clear just what the Saudis are trying to do in Lebanon, so that's kind of wait and see. But for now, it's kind of pressure is increasing on the Lebanese government to take more action against Hezbollah, which is sort of allied with Iran. And the Lebanese government is not really allied with the Saudis, but the Saudis can put a lot of pressure on them. In terms of arresting rival princes, that's basically the government. That's basically Mohammed bin Salman, sort of the prince who's in line for the throne, cementing his hold on power. The trend in Saudi Arabia for the past year has been this kind of power play by Mohammed bin Salman and his father to ensure that he becomes the next king and stays the king for a very long time. And so other centers of power are kind of being reduced. They're not being removed entirely. It's just being made clear who's the boss, basically. And it's also part of what may be a reform effort to try to clean up the Saudi economy, which is kind of riddled with corruption and privileges and patronage and all this kind of thing. So he may be cracking down on some of the more egregious abusers in the Saudi royal family of the family's position in the Saudi economy. So kind of trying to make the economy more open, more competitive, trying to make it so that you don't have to know a guy in the royal family in order to get a project done or something to that effect. So it's part of the overarching reform effort that Mohammed bin Salman has been implementing. We also talked about that last week, how he's trying to reform the Saudi economy, diversify the economy away from oil, and develop other aspects of the economy so that the country can become more self-sufficient, not so dependent on oil. So basically, it's all part of, one, economic reform, two, political power play, cementing power. We talked. I won't get into it like we did last week because that's an extended conversation. But there are a lot of implications as far as the Saudi royal family becoming less dependent on Islamist conservatives in the kingdom, possibly becoming more liberal in terms of social norms, but not politically. It's explicitly not a political liberalization. It's pretty much exclusively for the economic and social sphere. So that's kind of a mixed, garbled answer. I would refer back to last week for a better version of that. let's see. Hey, Miss, can you give me an insight? Can you give an insight, you, the current events of Tibet? Current events of Tibet. There's not much going on in Tibet, as far as I know. If there is, the party's doing a good job of keeping it quiet. That's definitely not unusual for the party, though. The big thing I remember from Tibet happened way back in like, God, it was almost 10 years ago, I guess, almost around the Beijing Olympics in 2008. In the lead up to that, there was a number of protests in Tibet. I think it was in like the year before or something like that. And the party really had to crack down in order to kind of get things quiet again. There was a series of immolations, as I recall, people burning themselves in public in protest. But the party was pretty quick to, put a crimp on that. Other than that, there hasn't been a whole lot going on. Again, the party does a good job of kind of preventing foreign journalists from getting around too much. So it's not clear.
Is there any
there will
context
probably
in the question about like?
No, there wasn't any. There was even, he apparently even asked him for some elaboration, but there wasn't any. But that's fine. Again, regardless of the context, there's just not much there that I can go into. As far as the situation in general in Tibet, it's not clear just how much support the party really has. It doesn't really matter, though, because there's been a big influx of ethnic Han Chinese into Tibet over the past roughly half century, such that Tibet is what I think roughly half Chinese and half Tibetan at this point. So, even if you had open political competition, probably pro-Chinese, pro-government people would be a significant part of the polity in Tibet at this point, just because of that migration. And, without being able to do a thorough study, it's not clear what the effect of that migration has been thus far and will be in the future on the Tibetan culture. From what I've read, the government is kind of pushing a lot, because there's a lot of Buddhist, what would you call it, Buddhist monasteries, or whatever the equivalent is in Buddhism in Tibet. And the government has cracked down on them and made it kind of harder to operate freely in them, and has ensured that you can practice Buddhism, but you have to recognize the supremacy of the party and the Chinese government. And you also have to condemn the Dalai Lama, whom of course is a foreign enemy in China. That's a weird conversation to have with Chinese. They kind of see him as an enemy. They grow up in China, and you're taught that the Dalai Lama is a separatist, someone who hates China, somebody who wants to tear the country apart, and then they travel over here in the West, and he's just kind of a guy, So it's a little surreal for them. But Tibetans in these monasteries are made to disavow the leadership of the Dalai Lama. The party definitely does not want the Dalai Lama having any kind of constituency in Tibet amongst Buddhists, or Tibetans in general, for that matter. And it's more or less been effective. It's impossible to tell without being able to go there and talk to people openly. I've read some articles by journalists who traveled there, but it was always sort of as part of a government-supervised trip. And of course, there are government minders around, and Tibetans they talk to probably would be mindful of that fact and not give fully open answers. And the government, for its part, has no interest in assisting, facilitating free open discourse between foreign journalists and Tibetans there. So that was also limited. It's just very difficult to tell, given the closed nature of the Chinese political system, just what's going on there and where how the area is changing politically, in terms of how loyal the Tibetans are to China, how they feel about the Dalai Lama, how they feel about the economic and demographic changes to Tibet, etc. I do know that Tibet's urbanizing a bit. The capital and some other cities are growing, but overall the population is still pretty small, and there's just not a lot in Tibet. I think the principal economic activity is tourism, which is not a great driver of economic development. The Chinese who go to live there, they generally try to make it work, and generally, I think, live more in the cities. But other than that, I don't think they filter out into the wider countryside. And I don't think from what I've read, I don't know that a lot of Tibetans necessarily benefit from that economically. I think a lot of them end up sort of in the lower tier jobs in the cities. And I know there was some tension, and again in 2008 when those protests broke out, and a number of Chinese were attacked by Tibetan protesters of one sort or another. Again, haven't heard anything since, so that may or may not be a good sign. Maybe the party's just really good at suppressing dissent, or maybe that people don't really care as much. I have to think over the long term that the Tibetan culture will just be diluted and that more and more people will just assimilate into broader Chinese culture. There are rural parts of Tibet that will probably remain isolated and remain more or less Tibetan, but as more of the population lives in urban areas, as will probably be inevitable, given urbanization and the course of economic development, it'll just get harder and harder to kind of maintain that distinctive identity. So that may or may not, that may or may not pan out in the long term, but I would bet against them, frankly. And the odds are definitely not in their favor when you're dealing with over 1 billion ethnic Han Chinese. Although it's not like in-migration is huge, it's just big enough that it can demographically, probably in the future, become the dominant ethnic group there. But the overall population of Tibet is only like, what, 1 million, 2 million? It's not a whole lot. Maybe a couple million at most. But even just, a couple 100,000 or 1 million or so Chinese migrants is enough to tip the balance in that regard. So, kind of an ambiguous answer. I mean, basically, I don't know. I haven't heard anything, but that's kind of a brief rundown of modern Tibet, at least politically speaking. The Chinese, for their part, the Chinese government, for its part, is probably not so much interested in developing Tibet economically or, really repressing Tibetan culture. It's probably most interested in the water. That's the principal strategic resource in Tibet at this point. Again, I don't know that there's really much else there that they would want, other than the land, anyway. Kind of use as a buffer between the Chinese, the central, the core of China, which is sort of the east coast and the Sichuan province and the Sichuan basin. But other than that, anyway, it's the water that's really useful. The Tibet and the Tibetan Plateau is the source of a number of major river systems, and northeastern China in particular is kind of dry, and it actually suffers from a shortage of water. So the water from Tibetan Plateau could be useful in that regard if they could, find a way to transport it or what have you. Yeah, that's the most I've got off the top of my head.
Facts actually has read quite a bit about Tibet in her university experience. Very kind of pro-Tibet. The Han Chinese have a sort of, it seems like an assimilation strategy, where they're gradually chipping away at other smaller demographics to make Han Chinese, make China Han rather, kind of make everyone the same. And a lot of times they think of that as, well, what conflict is there if we're all the same, kind of thing, as opposed to letting people do their own thing. They want to unify, make sure everyone's on the same page, everyone identifies the same way, and that sort of thing. And China is a huge territory, so that's a very difficult process. We've talked about the Uyghurs before, who are, they're kind of Caucasian-looking people they're Muslim, right? Predominantly?
Yeah, predominantly Muslim.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different groups in China that are very much not Han, but there's that kind of heavy pressure over time to become more Han and to think and act and worship or whatever like we do. We talked about Christianity in China and how they really like to emphasize churches that put the state first. Jesus can be second place, the church is first place, just so we're clear. But then you're good to go with your singing and your dancing and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's the Chinese government is in a good position to implement an assimilationist strategy because the country is 95% ethnic Han Chinese. They have the overwhelming weight of numbers on their side. The Soviets didn't have that advantage. In the Soviet Union, it was only, I think, by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, I think it was only 50% Russia. And then the rest was all minorities of one sort or another. Iran today is similar. I think only like half of Iran's population is actually ethnically Persian. The rest are Azeris and Kurds and sundry other groups. But not the case in China. Everybody in China is Han. You can kind of debate that, though. I mean, a lot of people who are Han Chinese actually have a lot of distinctions in terms of regional, to a degree, regional culture, probably much more regional languages, which are often mutually unintelligible. So, to a degree, largely similar, but you could argue the notion that everybody's ethnic Han in China is kind of more a product of several centuries of successive imperial dynasties kind of hammering the population into compliance. You're all our subjects, you're all Chinese, you're all the same culture, etc. And so after a while, everybody kind of accepted that logic and thinking, and everybody self-identifies accordingly. But it may be that a more objective analysis of the ethnography of China might reveal more distinctions there, such that you might actually see distinctive ethnicities among groups who had traditionally identified as that one Han ethnicity. That's not likely to happen, because of course the Chinese government now, like all Chinese governments for the past umpteen thousand years, however long it's been, have had no interest in creating divisions amongst the population. They want them all to identify as a single people so that there can be a national cohesion. The Chinese government has no desire, especially after the so-called century of humiliation, to allow anything that could disrupt the unity of the nation. So probably not going to be any big anthropological expeditions in that vein anytime soon. But it would be super interesting if there were, because there are definitely differences between people who identify as Han Chinese. It's just kind of hard to tease them out when the government of the country doesn't really want you to tease out those differences. But back to the ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and what have. There's like 60 or something in China. The odds are not in their favor, because one of the arguments for assimilation in China is that if people want to advance, if people want good education, if they want a good job, if they want opportunities, then they kind of have to learn Mandarin. Because if you want to go to college, you're invariably going to have to go to a Mandarin-speaking college. And so if you want to learn skills, you have to be able to speak Mandarin. If you want to participate in government, you have to speak Mandarin. There's all these aspects of modern society that require knowledge of Mandarin. And so there's a good argument to be made that teaching the local minorities the national language, Putonghua, Mandarin Chinese, is a good way to help them advance. It's not just purely assimilationist, but also a good tool. But of course, by teaching them the language and then exposing them to broader society, there is just naturally an assimilationist process occurring. People inevitably modernize with the overarching modern culture. They move to the big city, they live in the university with people who are probably mostly Han Chinese, and they speak almost exclusively Mandarin while they're there, and then they live in a Mandarin-speaking city, so after a while, you just kind of assimilate naturally. It just becomes harder and harder to maintain any kind of distinct ethnicity at that point. The only places where it really happens in any country, not just China, is really the rural areas, because you don't have those pressures. Because you're not really acclimating to the modern world as much. You don't have to know the language of the modern world as much. You don't have to assimilate into the modern world's culture as much. And because there's that lack of pressure, people in the rural areas tend to preserve the old culture much better. You can kind of see that in, Russia with all the minorities there. You could see that in Turkey with the Kurds. It's almost always the rural areas where the traditional identity is the strongest. But, again, as the economy in China develops, it just gets harder as a larger and larger percentage of the minority population urbanizes, moves to the urban areas, tries to partake of economic opportunities there, and then are subjected to the laws of the predominant culture and the predominant culture's norms and processes and institutions. Those are all, again, Mandarin Han Chinese. So the more progress there is economically, the more people are educated and enjoy modern, the fruits of modernity, the more subject, at the same time, the more subject they are to those assimilationist pressures, and the more they will assimilate. Hypothetically, there could be like a nationalist uprising in which Tibetans or Uyghurs or what have you push for more autonomy or independence. But the party is pretty good at, clamping down on that. It's very good at handling dissent, or more accurately, preventing dissent, or crushing it as the need may be. So I don't think they're going to manage that. If nothing else, the party has shown in the past that if it faces a serious internal threat, it'll deal with it violently. And given how much more powerful Chinese institutions are, they can again, the Chinese army, the People's Liberation Army, has something like well over 1 million members in it. And that's probably almost as large as the entire population of Tibet. So if the Chinese government really wants to go to bat and, fight it out with the Tibetans or the Uyghurs in the event of a nationalist uprising, they would invariably win. And I don't think any of China's neighbors or even the United States would really want to interfere with such a conflict. They might kind of gripe from the sidelines and bitch about human rights and, self-determination and all that, but there's not really much anybody can do if China really decides to clamp down on its minorities in the event of a big civil conflict of that sort. So, barring liberalization of China's political culture, in which the party itself, or the Chinese government itself, decides to take a more liberal approach to allow more autonomy for ethnic minorities and try to more actively preserve traditional cultures, they're probably going to be assimilated, and it probably just won't be a big issue in the future. They might just end up like Native Americans in the US, where you have some left who are kind of distinctly Native American, but where most kind of assimilate and just sort of disappear into the broader population. We'll see. Well, there may be big developments when the Dalai Lama dies, because there is some question about who his successor will be. The Chinese government is not going to be interested in the successor declared by the Dalai Lama himself. And I think they've actually got a guy. They've got a kid who I think they declared was the successor. And there's some, I think, discussion. From what I've read anyway, there's some dispute, some disquiet in Tibet as far as who's the rightful heir to the position, I guess, of Dalai Lama. And, for those who don't know, Dalai Lama is basically, head honcho in Tibetan religious culture. As far as Tibetan Buddhism goes, it's traditionally been hierarchical, and the head of the hierarchy was the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama was also basically emperor of Tibet. It was his kingdom, so it's also, well, it used to be anyway, also a political position. And, a lot of Chinese criticism of the Dalai Lama centers on the fact that he's just a politician, a political actor, using religion to try to, formerly they said he was just trying to retain political power. Now that he's out of power, now they're just saying that he's trying to maintain or get that power back. That's not going to happen. I sincerely doubt the Dalai Lama is ever going to go back to China.
I was reading some
Tibet,
discussion about him potentially deciding not to reincarnate, because that's kind of what the flow is, where when a Dalai Lama dies, they kind of say general vicinity of where they're going to reincarnate, and then usually some authorities in Buddhism will say, hey, it's this kid. This is the reincarnated Dalai Lama. But if he says when he's about to die that he's not going to reincarnate, then that prevents China from being able to claim who it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and that may or may not work. It may just not matter. And, it may be that Beijing's control over the monasteries is tight enough to either ensure recognition of their preferred candidate, or to make rejection of that candidate meaningless or impossible. It may be that a lot of people in Tibetan monasteries really don't agree with don't think that Beijing's preferred candidate is going to be the next successor, is the proper successor. But it may be that they just don't have any room to express that or do anything about it, such that it becomes irrelevant. And, if that's the case for another generation or two, then eventually opposition just won't mean anything. People will have to pretend to at least pretend to recognize China's candidate, Beijing's candidate. And then as memories kind of fade, eventually, probably, they just won't really remember the Dalai Lama or care much in future generations. And that effect will be greater if there's a lot of economic development and urbanization because then there will be fewer people coming into the monasteries. There will be better opportunities, alternatives in cities as far as economic opportunity. So that'll kind of drain the blood, so to speak, of traditional Tibetan institutions, such as Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. Yeah, the party actually used to have a more open approach to managing minorities way back in, I think, after the Civil War. In the first 15, 20 years, they were a bit more open to them. They had lots of conciliatory policies, things like affirmative action, basically they were exempt from the one-child policy, and they continue to be so. So they've gotten some preferential treatment over the past few decades, but there was kind of more openness as far as the cultures themselves in the first decade or two of Communist Party rule in China. And then, of course, there was the big Tibetan uprising in, I think it was the late 50s or so, and the Cultural Revolution later. And both of those events led to a significant clampdown on free expression of culture, minority culture. And then things kind of started to open up again in the 80s, sort of in the Deng Xiaoping reform era. And I think Hu Yaobang was among several who wanted to take things in a more liberal direction in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways would have been in terms of governing minorities, governing minority territories, rather, such as Xinjiang and Tibet, what have you. But of course, Hu Yaobang and sort of the other liberal reformers in the 80s kind of got pushed aside after the Tiananmen Square massacre. That was sort of the event at which the old hardliners were able to move in and reestablish their power, to reestablish a conservative course for China's future. So the position of minorities has basically been not one of outright oppression. It's not really hardened, you have to speak this and you have to do that. But the government does go out of its way to try to undermine the local cultures to a degree in order to encourage assimilation. And also, of course, the party goes out of its way to ensure no centers of potential political opposition can ever arise. So it keeps a tight hold over the management of monasteries and other institutions indigenous to the region. To any minority region. Any institutions in the region, the Communist Party moves in, takes control of, and exerts a great deal of oversight on. And, they do little things like make people make oaths to the Communist Party, recognize the leadership of the Communist Party, swear loyalty to the government, denounce traditional leaders, things like that. Little things that are just meant to sort of discount traditional practices and encourage loyalty, if not sort of more what they would call modern tendencies, modern thinking, if you will. Yeah, there's not a great deal of regard for traditional culture in the party, but they recognize at the same time that they just can't ban it. They need to allow some room for it to breathe. Otherwise, there will be, resistance, and the party doesn't want resistance, certainly not violence. So it gives minorities and specifically traditional minority cultural institutions enough space in which to continue existing, but it tries to kind of put pressure on them such that they wither over time. So there's not enough pressure to incite rebellion, but there's enough there to kind of suffocate them, kind of asphyxiate them slowly, kind of like boiling the frog in a way. We'll see what Xi Jinping wants to do. We've talked before about how Xi Jinping has unprecedented power in China right now. Mm-hmm. And, if he were so inclined, he could change direction in terms of the Communist Party's policy vis-a-vis minorities. I doubt he will. There hasn't been any sign he will, and I don't think minorities have been a big topic of discussion in the party. Not that I would know, but from what I've read about the party and its policies, they're not. I don't think that's going to be on the agenda. I don't think it's a priority for Xi Jinping. We'll see. We'll see how that plays out. Oh, by the way, if my if I suddenly disappear, it's probably because my computer randomly shut down again. It was giving me trouble last night. I suspect it's overheating, It's been better behaved since I cleaned it out last night, and there was a lot of dust clogging up the fans, so managed to clean that up, and it's been all right since then. But it could happen again, so if I randomly disappear, that's probably why.
When's the last time you cleaned it out?
Oh god, I don't even remember. It's been a long time. So it was definitely dirty. I'm hoping it was just the dust, because if it's a hardware problem, that's going to be expensive to fix.
Yeah.
Yeah, dust, not so expensive. Spray it with air and it's done. Oh, by the way, how's the sound? Is the sound okay this week?
It's good. There have been a few of those little jumps in volume where it's like really loud for a few milliseconds, but I don't know what causes that.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I should get a proper mic or something. And the headset I use is kind of old. All right. So let's see. What was the next question? How do you think that the relationship between America and Turkey is going to be in the near future, considering the election of Trump as a variable as well? Yeah, we've talked about this off and on for the past couple months. The future relationship between America and Turkey. Well, probably status quo. That's always the safest bet. You know, the Erdogan administration has made a lot of noise about the United States kind of plotting against it, and not doing enough to denounce the coup plotters from last year, not what's the word, extraditing, exporting. The word slips my mind, but basically sending them Gulen, Fethullah Gulen, who is the guy that the government blames for the coup. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. That's a whole other discussion. So there's definitely been some anti-American vitriol from the Turkish government and the Erdogan administration over the past few years. But at the same time, they haven't really they don't seem to be moving in the direction of a decisive break with the United States. That doesn't seem to be on their agenda, and they probably don't think it's in their interest. They probably figure it's better to stay in a relationship with the United States in which there are clear commitments and boundaries, rather than leaving and then being subject to the whims of Washington, basically. The United States could do any number of things to Turkey if Turkey were not in NATO or a part of the broader sort of Western alliance. So probably a formal break with the West and the United States is not in the cards. That would be very risky for the Turkish government. They'll probably continue putting distance between themselves and the West diplomatically and asserting a stronger Turkish role in the region and asserting Turkish preferences as far as foreign policy in the Middle East. But I don't think that they'll go so far as to just formally break with the United States. I know that they've cozied up a bit with Russia over the past year, but I don't think they see Russia as like a really good ally. It's more like a frenemy in a way. kind of a rival that they have to deal with, because Russia's interest in the region are not amenable to Turkish interest in the region. Erdogan has a very different vision for the region than Putin does. Putin is just a status quo guy, basically. Russia's foreign policy in the Middle East is basically uphold the status quo and appear to be a strong supporter, appear to be a good ally, such that countries in the region have more incentive to try to align with Russia and basically buy Russian military equipment, which is, a broader interest of Russia. Their military industry needs money, and they don't, having to compete with the United States and Europe and China and India and, everybody else who produces equipment. It's hard to generate enough revenue to maintain what had been a very large and significant military-industrial complex built up over the course of the Cold War. Weren't quite in the position to maintain that in the 90s, and so they're trying to preserve what's left, basically, trying to generate some sales. Not all foreign policy is generating military sales, and not all of Russia's policy in the region has to do with military sales, but by ensuring that Russia looks like a good ally and encouraging countries to improve their relations with Russia, one of the little ways that you can improve relations is to basically sign defense deals. That's one of the big sort of signals you can send. So it's very helpful for Russia in that regard. Not in a whole lot of other ways. I don't really think the Russian government cares all that much about terrorism in the Middle East or, you know, helping the Syrian government or any of that sort of thing. I think it's part of a broader strategic move on the part of the Moscow to generate leverage vis-a-vis the West and the Ukraine issue and the sanctions and all of that. You know, if the Ukraine crisis and the Crimean crisis had not happened, I doubt that Russia would be in Syria right now. They probably wouldn't have cared that much. But anyway, that's getting off on a tangent. You know, the Russians, for their part, they're in, you know, they're there for their own reasons. But Turkey has like an actual vision. You know, Erdogan specifically has a vision. You know, he wants to reassert Turkish power, if not hegemony, in the region, and wants to significantly increase Turkish influence in other countries' politics, in their economies, if not also their cultures. You know, he's well established at this point as being something of a social conservative. I wouldn't quite call him an Islamist per se, but he's definitely socially conservative. So there is sort of that vision for the region and Turkey's role in it, and that's kind of what the Turkish government is building. And to a degree, that puts them at odds with the United States in so much as their vision contrasts with American preferences. But you know, it's also not necessarily a bad thing from America's perspective, because one of the shifts over the past 5 to 10 years, well, probably more 5 years, but 5 to 10 years, there's been a shift in Washington towards kind of outsourcing management of regional problems. You know, it used to be that the United States was sort of the arbiter of conflicts in regions, that the United States would step in and settle them or send in peacekeepers or what have you. But there was a desire to be less involved in regional affairs because, you know, of the Iraq War and all of the discontent over that. There was a sense that regional powers should take more responsibility for handling regional problems, and that the United States should only step in the event of a significant emergency. And so that gave countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia more ambit to exert their own policies, their own preferences, basically in exchange for pulling out of the region and having a smaller presence. The United States gave those countries more room to maneuver, you know, more space in which to implement their preferences. The Turks were kind of the first to do that in a big way in Syria. The Saudis are catching up now. You know, one of the reasons Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia has been so aggressive in terms of foreign policy, you know, in terms of Yemen and Qatar, Syria, and maybe Lebanon soon. Part of the reason is because there was a sense from the United States, you know, there was a kind of push from the United States to do more in the region. You know, there was a sense that if they wanted to exact their preferences in the region, that they couldn't rely on the United States to do it for them anymore. They would have to do it themselves. So that's also a big reason that there's been so much more Saudi activity in the region over the past 5-10 years. Kind of getting away from Turkey there. So yeah, Turkey has its own vision for the region, and you know, Russia is not. I doubt that the Russian government is all that gung-ho about social conservatism in the Middle East. So they're probably not altogether eager to see that Turkish vision come to fruition. Furthermore, the Turks are more or less actively trying to overthrow the government in Syria, which is a Russian ally, and that probably doesn't endear them either. So, in so much as Turkey and Russia have gotten closer, I don't think it's because they're laying the groundwork for an alliance. I think it's more that they're just negotiating. They're sort of negotiating the role of Turkey in the region, how much power they can exert, what their respective spheres of influence are, etc. So Turkey is becoming more independent diplomatically, basically. I don't think that's going to include a break with the United States. I think the government in Turkey still sees value there, and I think the American government also sees value there. There's some talk in the United States about, you know, kind of putting more pressure on Turkey in terms of human rights and democratization and, you know, all that jazz, but it hasn't really gotten any traction. You know, there's a sense that it's better just to deal with the government as it is than try to change it and then maybe gain its enmity and lose a potential ally. You know, however bad things now, they could be worse. The United States alienates and isolates Turkey. That just sort of pushes them out of the Western camp and puts them in a position to do, you know, cause all kinds of trouble. Who knows what Erdogan would do without that kind of check and balance of the Western alliance and the benefits it brings. So it's kind of a quick and dirty answer to that. Let's see. What do you think of Macedonia's relations with its neighbors and their recent move to befriend and acknowledge shared history with Bulgaria and to a degree Greece? Wow, yeah. We finally get to talk about Macedonia. This has been coming for a long time.
Is it Macedonia or Macedonia?
That's a good... I don't know, actually. I've always just called it Macedonia, but maybe it is Macedonia.
Do we have any Macedonians in the chat?
Probably not. There's not very many. Yeah, so Macedonia, I'll just call it Macedonia, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Macedonia has been subjected to probably what is one of the dumbest international relations disputes in the world over the past 20, 30 years. It's not particularly sensible. It has to be aggravating. Basically what happened was Macedonia had been a part of Yugoslavia. It was one of the constituent republics in Yugoslavia. And then, like all the other constituent republics, they broke off and became an independent country in the early 90s or so as a result of, or as part of, the Yugoslav civil wars. And they have always been, it's a small country, it's relatively poor, they don't really do a whole lot. There was some political violence, I think, in the 90s after independence because of the Albanian minority. But other than that, it's been relatively quiet. So they, like most countries in the region, kind of started trending towards the West, and specifically the European Union. And so they kind of applied, and they did all the democratization stuff and all of the free market reform that was required for consideration for accession to the European Union. And then what they found was that Greece was opposed to them joining. Greece would vote against them. And so the reason why is that there was a suspicion in Greece that Macedonia would try to claim the Greek province of Macedon, which is in northern Greece on the border with Macedonia. And they believed that to be the case because they asserted that the Macedonians believed themselves to be successors of the ancient Greek state of Macedon. I don't think it was a city-state; it was more like a kingdom, I think. But regardless, there was an ancient Greek kingdom called Macedon, and the Greeks believed that the Macedonians believed that they were successors to that previous kingdom of Macedon, and that in the future they might try to claim their province, try to claim Greece's Macedon province. Mind you, Macedonia is filled with ethnically Slavic people. They're definitely not Greek, and the Greek province of Macedon is not full of ethnic Macedonians. It's, as far as I know, it's full of Greeks. So this Greek fear was pretty unfounded. But they refuse to give it up. I mean, they just insist that Macedonians think this, and that if Macedonia... The condition is, what Greece is demanding is that if Macedonia wants the Greek vote to get into the European Union, then they have to change the country's name. They can't call themselves Macedonia. They say that the fact that the country calls itself Macedonia is evidence that they see themselves as successors to the Kingdom of Macedon, and that they're going to claim Greece's province in the future. And so there's this persistent belief that the only way for Macedonia and the government there to signal that they're not going to make a claim on Greece's province is to change the country's name entirely. And the compromise they reached in the 90s was to change the country's name from Macedonia to the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which is why in international institutions like the UN and places like that, whenever Macedonia is mentioned, it has to be referred to as the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. You can't actually really call it Macedonia. That's not quite the proper technical name. And that was the compromise, but it hasn't been enough. Greece has still refused to vote for them, to allow them into the European Union, basically. And part of the reason for that is that there's a lot of people in Macedonia who do insist that they are successors, that they do have lineage going back to the Kingdom of Macedon. And there's even like a big statue of Alexander the Great there. Alexander the Great was, I think, born in Macedon. His family ruled Macedon, and that was sort of where he started his big campaign to conquer the world. So there's a lot of resentment in Macedonia for this claim. Like, for them, why does it matter whether they see themselves as successors of Macedon or not? It shouldn't be relevant to them, and Greece shouldn't be able to kind of bully them in that regard and make them change their whole country's name. And so while they're willing to compromise, obviously they already changed the name to a degree, they kind of refuse to publicly say that, no, we're not descended from the kingdom of Macedon, and we're not going to do this, that, or the other vis-a-vis Greece and its province. And because of that sort of culture war between Greece and Macedonia, Macedonia has yet to be incorporated into the European Union, and that's about the only major bloc. I think everything else is kind of in place. So that's kind of the biggest issue Macedonia has with its neighbors. I think I read somewhere that they're very closely related to Bulgarians in terms of ethnicity and language. Like, the languages are mutually intelligent, etc. But
Intelligible.
Yeah, mutually intelligible, rather. They can understand each other's languages very easily. Obviously, there's a large Albanian minority. They kind of speak their own language. That's a little bit different. But Macedonian itself is very close to Bulgarian, and there are some Bulgarian nationalists who kind of have made the argument that Bulgaria should annex Macedonia, that they should be unified. That hasn't really played great in Macedonia. But Bulgarian nationalists seem to like the idea. Probably won't happen. I don't know how relations are with Serbia. I don't think there's a lot of there. I think Serbia just kind of ignores them. Serbia fought really hard to maintain Bosnia, or at least to incorporate the Republika Srpska, the Serbian parts of Bosnia, into Serbia. And, there was also violence when Croatia and Slovenia left the Republic. But I don't remember ever really reading about any violence when Macedonia left. I don't know that Serbia really cared all that much that Macedonia was leaving. So that was one of the easier ejections from the Yugoslav Republic. Who else? I don't think they're neighbors with Montenegro. Have to look at a map. So Greece, Bulgaria, I think those are the principal ones. So they're basically, to answer the question, Macedonia's relations with her neighbors are a little bit turt. They're not great, especially with Greece. Relations with Bulgaria are better just because there's a common cultural affinity. They're both Slavic countries. They both have similar languages, etc. But I don't know that Macedonians appreciate the what may be a perhaps condescending attitude by Bulgarians towards Macedonia. It's kind of seeing them as a little brother almost. Yeah, I remember after World War II, there was actually a push, I think by Bulgaria, to unify all of the Slavic countries in the Balkans. Have Yugoslavia merge with Bulgaria and create one sort of unified Slavic state in the Balkans. But I don't think it took off because of Tito, if I'm remembering it correctly. For those who don't know, Yugoslavia was one of many countries in Eastern Europe that that was taken over by communists after the war. But in Yugoslavia's case, their example was a little bit unique in that the communists that took power were more autonomous than the communists in other countries. In other countries, communist parties with close ties to the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union would come to power or be assisted into power by the Red Army, depending. But in Yugoslavia, a guy named Tito and his communists had fought the Nazis for years and years and years. And when the Nazis left the country, were driven out, it was Tito's communists who kind of had the upper hand. And so they were able to kind of take control without a whole lot of assistance from the Red Army. I'm sure they had some, but there wasn't as much dependence on the Soviets for legitimacy like there was in other countries. The communists in Yugoslavia were relatively more organically able to take power. And as a result, Tito always had more of an independent streak. The Yugoslav government was not quite as beholden to Moscow. It probably didn't hurt that they were also kind of far away geographically. sort of more distant from the Soviet Union and other Soviet centers of power. And so the Yugoslav government managed to get themselves more or less exiled from the Eastern Bloc because they were seen as being too independent. There was actually a lot of tension between Tito and Stalin that emerged in the late 40s. And I think a lot of it was over the Marshall Plan. Because the United States, if you don't know what the Marshall Plan is, the Marshall Plan was this big plan that the United States enacted in the late 40s after World War II to send immense amounts of economic aid to countries in Europe recovering from World War II. Part of the goal of the plan was to, well, in general, it was meant to ensure the recovery of the continent's economy. But sort of behind that was a fear of communism. There was a sense that if Europe did not recover faster, that communists would inevitably become politically popular and would inevitably kind of take over. So there was a desire to improve the economy and conditions for everybody, but that was partly a political project to preserve anti-communist political forces in place. So the Soviets were very skeptical of the Marshall Plan and very suspicious of it, and they actually demanded basically that their communist allies in various countries in Eastern Europe not agree to participate in the Marshall Plan. And none of them did, except for Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia under Tito actually participated in the Marshall Plan and received Marshall Plan aid. And this was an immense source of aggravation for Moscow. And basically, they kicked them out. They sort of disowned them. And Yugoslavia, for the entirety of the Cold War, was not actually a part of the Eastern Bloc, even though it was a communist country. It basically was non-aligned. In fact, I think they were one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. States that didn't really side with the U.S. or the Soviets, who kind of tried to chart their own third way, their own neutral path. And Yugoslavia filled that role. That's what they did. They were not part of the Warsaw Pact. I don't think they were part of the Comintern, which is sort of the economic coordinating body between the different communist states in Eastern Europe. They just sort of went off and did their own thing for 40 years until it all kind of went wrong there at the end. And that led to the breakup, and then Macedonia kind of fell out of that. Not sure how I got into communism in Yugoslavia now that I try to remember, but anyway, some trivia for you.
Well, that's cool to range around. Actually, here, let me pull up the map because I think Macedonia, it's not a country that gets talked about that much, so I think for a lot of people, they have no idea even where it is. But we have some clues, so we're talking about Greece, Bulgaria, neighborhood. Alright, full screen, boom, we're gonna find this. Alright, sweet, found it. What is it? Yep, it even says it on Google Maps. Macedonia, and then in parentheses, FYROM, former Yugoslavia. Wait, Yugoslavic Republic of Macedonia? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah.
All right, there's your visual aid team.
Yeah, it's a very kind of, it's a very wordy phrase, it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, yeah, I see it now. Yeah, there's Little Macedonia, and then to the north, Kosovo and Serbia, Bulgaria to the east, and then Greece to the south, and then Albania to the west. Yeah, hence the Albanian minority. I don't know how relations are with Albania. Probably not great. Everybody in the region pretty much hates Albanians. They're sort of... Albania is actually a Muslim country. Technically. Over the course of the Cold War and the communist rule there, it was actually... what was it? I can't remember what it was, like Hohat or something like that. That was the leader's name. And they followed like a very austere Maoist form of communism. And they actually also ended up getting kind of exiled from the Comintern and the Eastern Bloc as well, because they sided with the Chinese in the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s. But atheism was the official religion. And so over time, Islamic tradition and religious practice sort of faded with time. So I think atheism is sort of the dominant religious affiliation in Albania now. But technically, historically, it's been a Muslim country, and there are still Muslims there.
What is this kind of dotted border between Serbia, Kosovo?
Uh, that that represents the disputed border, or rather the disputed status of Kosovo.
Mm-hmm.
Kosovo is technically an independent state. It's recognized as such by the United States and the European Union. But Serbia insists that it's an integral part of Serbia, and that it illegally was sort of broken off from Serbia by NATO, among other, malicious actors, as a result of international campaign and international intervention in, I think, 1999. I remember when that happened. Actually, I was a kid at the time, and I remember watching on the news about how the United States and NATO planes were bombing in Serbia, and it had to do with ethnic cleansing. Basically, there was, one of the big trends over the past couple decades in the Balkans has been Albanian minorities rising up against what they could perceive to be, oppression in their respective states. Yugoslavia and southern Serbia being sort of the first example. That actually kind of got started in the early 1980s and is a sort of continuing source of debate, whether or not the Albanians started this sort of kicked over the first domino that led to the Yugoslav wars, whether that was their fault or whether it was sort of Serb chauvinism and oppression in Yugoslavia that started it. Part of the issue is that Kosovo is considered by Serbs to be their historical homeland. Like, that's supposedly where ethnic Serbs really got started, and so it's sort of it has historical and cultural significance to ethnic Serbs. But over time, the population in Kosovo shifted such that demographically it was mostly ethnic Albanians. And eventually violence broke out in the 80s, and that kind of fed into the Yugoslav wars. And so different Albanian minorities around the region have risen up, and there's been, civil wars here and there over their status. And in Kosovo, they had stayed a part of Serbia after Yugoslavia broke up in the 90s. Although technically Yugoslavia continued in name until like 2006, but it was sort of in name only. I think they ended up changing the country's name to Serbia and Montenegro for a few years. This is a very unwieldy name. That lasted until Montenegro voted to become independent, so then it was just Serbia. But in 1999, there was more violence. A campaign of ethnic cleansing broke out. Again, this is all kind of debatable because the Serbs themselves have a very different perspective on this. But according to the Western perspective, there was a campaign of ethnic cleansing by the Serbian government in Kosovo that necessitated international intervention. And the result of that intervention is that basically the Serbian government was ejected from Kosovo, and Kosovo became a de facto protectorate of the European Union and NATO. And so for a long time, for like 10, 15 years, there was no clarity as to Kosovo's status, because it wasn't recognized as an independent state right away. Rather, pressure was put on Serbia to make necessary changes and whatnot. But over time, eventually Kosovo declared independence, and people just kind of countries started recognizing their independence. Russia has not. Russia fancies itself an ally of, Serbia, if not Slavic countries in general. That's kind of an old historical thing in Russia. But there's kind of a cultural affinity between Russia and Serbia. So Russia has never recognized Kosovo as an independent state. I think most Western countries have. Certainly the Europeans and the United States have. But Serbia has never given up trying to get Kosovo back. And they have a number of court cases in the European Court of Justice, I think, regarding the legality of Kosovo's separation from Serbia, the legality of its independence, etc. So as a result, Kosovo's final status has yet to be universally accepted and recognized. It's still technically debated. And so as a result, Google Maps has apparently decided to represent that disputed status in the form of a dotted line, which is normally used on maps to demarcate disputed territory, disputed borders, what have you. So that's a really long-winded answer to your simple question about why the border there is dotted.
Some people were joking in the chat about Catalonia, kind of wishing that they had a little dotted line.
Yeah, I'm sure they do, but having a dotted line requires outside support. We talked about a little bit about this before. If you're a smaller state who wants to separate from a larger state, if you're a separatist movement, there's not really like an easy legal way to do that. There's no process. There's no, constitutional clause that allows, a referendum on it or something. At least not a universal one. So, the only legal way to do it really is to just kind of forcibly do it. You have to build up a critical mass of support within the territory. You probably can't do it if it's only 50%. If you're a separatist and you don't have more than, probably 80% or so support from the population, it's probably not going to work. But if you reach a critical mass of support in your territory, then it becomes feasible. And then you have to start kind of building up some credible deterrent to the state's efforts, because there's going to be efforts by the dominant country to prevent you from separating. You have to have a credible deterrent, so some kind of military force or militia or nonviolent resistance movement, some campaign of disruption that makes governance impossible, something to that effect, to make that you can use as a tool in order to coerce or otherwise use as leverage against the national government. And then, even then, you probably almost certainly need outside support of some kind. If you don't have any outside support, then hypothetically, the dominant state can really just go to town on you and just send in the army, and then you've got a whole new set of problems. And generally, states like that, sub-states, separatist states, generally don't have as much power at their disposal than the dominant government they're trying to separate from. So in the event of like a full-on war, generally they can't really win, or won't. Sometimes they do, but generally the odds are not in their favor. So you need some kind of international recognition and support as well. So that's 3 conditions you have to meet, and none of them are easy to do. So in Catalonia's case, they kind of had none of those. They didn't have universal support within Catalonia. They didn't have outside support. They didn't have like a credible deterrent of any kind, so it wasn't any great shock when it failed, and will likely continue to fail going forward unless they start meeting some of those conditions. But in Kosovo's case, they met a lot of those. They had outside support, especially with, the ethnic violence going on, and they had a credible deterrent. They had their own militia, and they had a lot of support within Kosovo. So all of the conditions were met, and it ended up working out. It doesn't always work out even if you meet those conditions, though. Sometimes it just isn't going to happen for diplomatic reasons. That's kind of why Kurdistan isn't independent. We've also talked about that before. But that's kind of, but that's the situation with Kosovo, and that's why they've kind of got that weird place on the map. And that's also why Albanians are kind of probably widely disliked in the region. They're kind of a big part of the reason for a number of the conflicts that have broken out over the past few decades. Again, I'm not saying it's their fault. I'm not going to assign blame one way or the other. I'm not going to get dragged into a huge debate about the Balkan Wars. That's not going to go anywhere. I can guarantee that much. If you're not, for those not familiar with the conflict in the Balkans over the past few decades, I don't know how many people listening are from outside Europe and the West, maybe some people in Asia or Africa, what have you, but they might not be familiar with the Balkans. But in Europe and in Western culture generally, in the West, so to speak, the Balkans has a reputation as being a very violent place, and is kind of defined by its political dysfunction and political violence, especially with the civil wars. But even before the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, the Balkans still had already had a reputation for being violent that went back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, when countries were regaining their independence from the Ottoman Empire. There was a number of Balkans wars in that period, and it was actually political violence in the Balkans that helped start World War I. That was when the Austro-Hungarian Empire had annexed Bosnia, which had a significant number of ethnic Serbs in it, and Serbia believed those Serbs should be, that territory should be part of Serbia. And so it was Serbian nationalists who assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand and, sort of knocked down that first domino that led to World War I. So it's always kind of been considered Europe's tinderbox. It's always been considered a very sensitive region that's always on the verge of exploding into warfare of some sort or another. I don't know if that reputation is still deserved. It's been pretty quiet for the past decade or two. They seem to be moving in a positive direction, and that's great news. It would be great if the region could settle, enjoy political stability, and have economic development and enjoy the fruits thereof. Everybody wants that, but a lot of the old rivalries are still there. A lot of that ethnic rivalry and dissension, vis-a-vis ethnic Albanians and Serbs and all these other groups. That's still a very real part of the political landscape there. So it's not entirely clear what's going to happen in the future. There's been talk in Bosnia that could lead to a rekindling of the conflict there. I would hope not, and I think the younger people there are not interested in it at all. But some of the older folks are definitely interested, very interested. And for those not familiar with Bosnia, it's actually not one country really. It's actually two countries. That was part of part of what was agreed at the Dayton Accords that ended the Yugoslav wars. Basically, the parts of Bosnia that were held by Serbs when the ceasefire was signed or agreed to, that's one country called Republika Srpska, and then the rest of it is sort of a Croat-Muslim alliance, federation, I think, of some kind. And then between them, there's sort of this confederate government, a single government that they both kind of answer to and participate in, which is the executive branch of which I think is operated by European Union officials. I think they actually assign a European Union guy to kind of oversee the whole mess to prevent it from spiraling out of control. But that arrangement held for a while, but there's always been discontent on the part of the Serbs. They've always wanted to join up with Serbia. But Europe hasn't wanted them to do that because of the implications for regional security. It could reignite the conflict, and it also sets a bad precedent because Serbia technically intervened, sent forces in and committed severe acts of violence in Bosnia over the course of the war. And so there's a sense that allowing Republika Srpska to join Serbia would reward Serbia's bad behavior. Again, this is the European Union's perspective. Don't yell at me because I'm not assigning blame to Serbia. I'm just saying this is the European Union's perspective. The European Union perceives that allowing Republika Srpska to accede to Serbia, join with them, would kind of reward Serbia's bad behavior in the civil war. And they don't want to set that precedent, so they're resistant to that. Whether or not that's efficacious over the long run is, up to a matter of debate. We'll see. But that's what's happening there. So, God, how did I get onto that? So many goddamn tangents. I apologize. Kind of chasing my tail here. The original thing was Macedonia, and I don't know what Macedonia's relations are with Albania. Maybe not great because of the violence with the Albanian minority there, but I don't think there's been a lot of violence over the past decade. I think I do remember listening to a podcast from ECFR where they talked a bit about recent political developments in Macedonia. I think there was an election recently, and the incumbent was basically using the intelligence service to spy on the opposition and trying to undermine them. And he got caught. There was like a big leak, and it was made very explicit that's what was happening. And so there was a big controversy in Macedonia over that. And I don't remember what the outcome was, but I remember that there was the concern on the part of the Europeans was that I say Europeans, but I mean the European Union. The concern on the part of the European Union was that Russia was interfering, or they suspected Russia of interfering on the side of one of their of a given candidate who they believed was more amenable to Russian interests. And the European Union, for its part, preferred the other candidate, whom wanted to integrate more with Europe and integrate corruption reforms and all that. Whether or not the corruption reforms would actually happen is a matter for debate. Corruption is, unfortunately, still a big part of Balkan political culture. Yeah, I don't remember the details of that issue, but it was a big deal in Macedonia, and it started a lot of foreign policy people talking about whether the United States should have a larger role in the region. Because right now, the U.S. policy in the region is basically let the Europeans handle it. It's not our concern. We don't care, really. I think the United States does still have some forces there as part of peacekeeping measures, but I don't get the impression Washington has that as a priority. I don't think they really care much. So there's basically the U.S. policy to the Balkans is to not have a policy. Unless Russia does something. Maybe if Russia does something more active there, maybe Washington would get more interested then, but until then, there seems to be a lot of disinterest. So, roughly, roughly, that's a rundown of Macedonia's relations with its neighbors. Let's see. I hope that addresses the question. It was a wandering, meandering answer, so I don't know if I got to the crux of what this person was asking, but that's what I can give you.
Chad is asking for a picture of us. I'm pretty sure
Picture
of us together. I think.
I
think there's.
I don't think we have any together. Tell you what, there was an Israeli journalist who got his head cut off by the Islamic State. I look almost exactly like that guy.
What the fuck? That's one hell of a description.
Well, he obviously was a lot thinner by the time they killed him because he'd been in prison and whatnot. But there are pictures of him before he was captured by the Islamic State. And I look very, very similar to that guy. So if you could find a picture of that guy and put his picture next to yours, basically that's a picture of us together.
Yeah, our group of friends didn't really emphasize photo shoots together. I know a lot of people have their Instagram game and they like all that kind of stuff where they have regular photo updates, but we were more just cool with conversation. We can talk about stuff. We don't necessarily need pictures. Not that those are bad things.
Yeah, so I don't know that we can. I don't know that we can meet that request, unfortunately. Yeah, just imagine a stereotypical fat neck beard, and then look at Neuro, and then imagine them together. There you go. There's your mental image. That's basically us together. So let's see. Kind of trying to think if I can remember anything else significant about the Balkans off the top of my head that might be relevant to Macedonia. I don't know that I could. I already talked about, to finish an earlier point, Tito and Yugoslavia alienated themselves from the Soviets. They were never really a part of the Eastern Bloc. And because of that alienation, the proposed project to unify Yugoslavia with Bulgaria never went through. I think, if I remember correctly, that was the big reason that it didn't happen. So anyway, could you talk about the future Greek? Could you talk about the Greek debt crisis and its implications for the EU in the future, especially given Brexit and the looming possible Spanish-Catalan split? Yeah, the Greek debt crisis. I knew this day would come that I'd have to talk about this, but you're never really quite ready for when it happens. Yeah, there are certain issues that are just hard to talk about because they're so contentious. I don't want to alienate anybody, but it's hard not to alienate at least some people when you're talking about something controversial, because invariably people read things into what you say, and they're like, oh, this guy's this or that, or he's wrong about this. I'll try to be neutral on this as possible, but I'm just saying, I'm foreshadowing it's going to be difficult because there are some strong opinions on this. So the Greek debt crisis, talk about the Greek debt crisis and its implications for the EU. So for those who don't know, Greece has never really been very good with its budget. It's always kind of borrowed too much money, and there's been periodic defaults over its history. That's not necessarily unusual. It was hoped that when Greece joined the European Union, and specifically when it adopted the euro, the currency, the euro, that these actions would instill more discipline. Because previously, whenever Greece defaulted on its debt, it would just devalue its currency. And what that does is it devalues the value of the debt. Because presumably, if the debt is owed in the Greek currency, which I believe was called the drachma, if I'm remembering correctly, if the debt was in drachma and the drachma became significantly less valuable, then effectively they've reduced the debt significantly, such that it's almost worthless. So devaluing currency was a quick and easy way to deal with the debt problems if you had unpayable amounts of debt. And it wasn't quite the same as a full-on default, but in markets, it's lowering your currency like that because you can't pay debt is considered an effective default. It's a de facto default, even if it's not technically a default. So previously, Greece had always just done that. But you can't do that if you don't control your own currency. And that's what happened. Greece adopted the euro as its currency, and the euro cannot be arbitrarily devalued by by the European Central Bank. It's very explicitly written in the European Union Central Bank's charter that they have to put inflation first. They can't modify the value of the euro based on political considerations. And that was very much a German thing. There was a lot of countries that wanted it and saw the wisdom in it, but for Germany in particular, that was a requirement. The Germans did not want a European central bank to be created that would be subject to political pressures. They wanted the bank to maintain the value and stability of the euro. That was their principal concern, because Germans have a big thing about hyperinflation. They were subjected to it twice over the course of the 20th century. And Germans in general value stability. That's kind of a cultural trait. They want stability, predictability. So they don't want a wildly fluctuating currency. So a precondition for Germany was the implementation of a European central bank that would not just devalue the euro in order to cut countries' debt. They did not want that process of maintaining monetary policy to be politicized. So as a result, Greece was in a position where they could continue their profligate borrowing, but then not be able to devalue their currency to deal with it, which would create basically the problem we have now. Or, as was hoped at the time, they would become more disciplined in their fiscal policy, not borrow as much money, and then they wouldn't have to worry about a debt default, because then they would be responsible and in their fiscal policy, and they would need to default on debt or devalue their currency. So that was the hope in the 90s, but unfortunately they went with the former option. And who you blame for that depends on your politics. It depends on your perception of the issue, your perspective. You could easily lay the blame on Greece's corrupt political culture, because in Greece's political culture, leaders generally kind of lead for the moment. They focus on giving goodies to their patronage networks, and if that means borrowing a lot of money and not really coming up with a way to pay it back, well, that's the next leader's problem. And so the can got kicked down the road, and eventually it all just kind of exploded in the Eurozone crisis in 2010. So let's see. So that would have been, 2008, when the financial crisis happened. And then I think it took 2 years for the Eurozone crisis to happen in 2010. And at that point, Greece had borrowed so much money, and market confidence had fallen because, again, overarching worldwide recession was creating issues for everybody. But as the Greek economy entered recession, there were big doubts about whether or not they'd ever be able to repay that debt, and so that led to a speculative, basically, run on Greek debt, and Greek debt was devalued significantly, and Greece, couldn't handle it. I mean, there's no way they can devalue their currency because they're using the euro, and the only other option basically is to just make massive cuts to government spending to try to restore confidence in markets that they'd be able to repay all the debt. But austerity of that size was not really practical, politically speaking. That was just kind of a no-go. And even if they had done it, it's unlikely markets would have had much confidence in them, because not only do you have to pass the austerity measures, you have to sustain them over time. And markets didn't think that, well, for one, that they would be sustained, and that even if they were sustained, that Greece would be able to generate enough economic growth that it would be able to repay all that debt. So Greek debt basically became worthless. It was a dead letter. And that became a big problem, though, for the wider financial health of Europe, because a number of major financial institutions had invested a lot of money in Greek debt. It wasn't a majority. It was, Greece didn't borrow so much money that it could have just crashed the whole euro system itself. The problem was one of contagion, because there were a number of other indebted countries in the European Union that used, like Italy and Spain, etc. A number of countries that had a lot of debt that the markets were getting suspicious of. So the market had already lost confidence in Greece, and its debt had been devalued significantly. But now the markets were getting skittish about Italy and Spain, which had much, much more debt than Greece did. And so there was a sense then that something had to be done in order to save Europe's financial institutions, in order to prevent them from imploding and causing a depression, as was suspected. The trouble was there were a lot of problems with moral hazard there. In particular, the Germans were very opposed to the idea of bailing out, so to speak, Greece. They didn't want to just bail Greece out and then to save all these big banks. For one, that creates a moral hazard for Greece. Countries like Greece can just borrow all the money they want and then default in it, knowing that the wealthier countries in Europe can just bail them out later. The Germans and other wealthy countries in Europe didn't want to set that precedent, and so opposed on that grounds. There was also the moral hazard for the banks. The banks could just lend money to whoever, and then when everything went wrong, they could just get bailed out by governments, by the European Union, whoever. So as a result of this conundrum, there was a lot of discontent in Germany and other countries about just what the course of action should be. And so there was a lot of debate about, all right, well, what does a good European do? Whatever led to this crisis, there's a crisis now and people are suffering and are going to suffer into the future if we don't try to handle this correctly. So a good European country should help them out. And that's so the argument for kind of bailing out Greece was made sort of on those grounds, as well as the grounds of preventing a continental recession, if not depression. And then, of course, the argument against was predicated on the moral hazard issue and not wanting to set that precedent. And I'm hoping I'm remembering all this right. I might be missing some important details and getting some things out of order. This is, again, off the top of my head. And I'll add this disclaimer here. I try to add it every week. I'm not an expert in all the stuff I talk about. Most of the stuff I talk about, I speak from reading, from experience, from just a lot of different things. And so again, if I'm wrong about something, which is very, very possible, by all means, post in chat about it. If anybody knows better or disagrees or has alternative information or whatever, by all means, add in chat. I don't read chat while we're doing this, but I read it later. So feedback is very welcome. Criticism is very welcome. This is a conversation, and participation is encouraged. And if I'm wrong about something, I want to know more than anybody. So by all means, correct me. All right. So that's the disclaimer. So just to kind of give you an idea of where I'm coming from on this. So Germany had, and I talk about Germany a lot because Germany was basically the only country with an economy strong enough to really pay for all this. And there was a sense even in Germany that this would basically be Germany doing the heavy lifting. And so people kind of hemmed and hawed, and there was, the crisis was getting worse, and there was all this talk about, well, maybe countries will just leave the euro so that they can devalue their currency and deal with the debt that way. And maybe even leave the European Union altogether. And there was a desire to prevent that from happening as well, to kind of preserve the European project, as it's referred to over there. So eventually a kind of pseudo-compromise was reached. Basically, Germany did not want to bail out Greece, but it recognized there was some need to bail out financial institutions in order to prevent a wider recession. And so the German government acceded to the European Central Bank, basically bailing out the banks by buying Greek debt, which was kind of the core problem. And this problem not only saved the banks because it was taking all this bad debt that was devaluing, it also prevented contagion because it kind of restored some confidence in the financial institutions as well as the European economy generally. There was just some sense that something was being done and that the economy would at least not go into recession, maybe stagnate, maybe enter a shallow recession, but it wouldn't be a deep depression, which would lead to a massive sell-off and probably a cascading set of defaults across Europe, and that would just be a huge clusterfuck in and of itself. That's what they were trying to avoid. And so they said, all right, the European Central Bank can buy this debt from these banks and alleviate the pressure on the banks. But they didn't want to do it in a way that was bailing out Greece. And so they went to Greece and said, all right, we're holding all this debt now, and you want us to forgive it. That's not going to happen. What's going to happen instead is we're going to punish you. And this is not what they publicly said. None of this was made publicly explicit. This is my understanding of it, inferring from the course of events. Basically, they wanted to punish Greece in order to set an example, in order to not establish a precedent. They wanted to bail out the banks, but they didn't want to set a precedent for bailing out countries, and so Greece was made to suffer a number of austerity measures. Now, austerity is kind of the conventional wisdom as far as what you do in order to reestablish market confidence, so that you can start borrowing from markets again. And the thinking was, all right, the Greek government will borrow less, spend less, the economy will recover over time, and then eventually markets will have confidence again, they'll be able to borrow as normal, and then it'll be settled over the long term. And in the meantime, the Greek government will suffer, politically, because obviously no government is going to be popular that implements austerity measures, certainly ones that are more or less imposed from outside. They'll suffer politically, so the political actors that contributed to the crisis over time will be punished. Because again, political culture in Greece, rather corrupt. So there was a desire to punish them, and then there was a desire to set an example for other countries. So that other countries can see, yes, Greece kind of got bailed out, but now they're having to suffer all of this austerity and outside influence and political unpopularity, and it's just a big mess. So definitely don't do this in the future. That was sort of the message being sent. And it worked. Nobody really talked about leaving the euro after that significantly, and the crisis kind of abated. The trouble was Greece's economy didn't recover. It didn't, the austerity measures were too steep, were too draconian. The debt payments on the debt were just too high. It was just not a practical arrangement. And so the Greeks kind of revolted against that. They started voting in governments that said that they would stand up to the Europeans, and then they would stand up to the Europeans and then cave in because they didn't have any leverage in the relationship. The European Union, and specifically the Troika, the European Central Bank, the IMF, and then I'm not sure if I can remember the third one. There was a third institution participating that was holding all of this Greek debt. And the Greek government would try to negotiate with them to cut the debt and end austerity, but it could never reach an agreement. And the thing is, this was all painted in the news as being purely an economic thing. Like, bailing out Greece was not painted that way at the time. At the time, it wasn't even painted as bailing out banks. It was just kind of a measure to respond to the Eurozone crisis, to try to restore confidence in the euro. Nobody really talked so much about bailing out banks and bailing out Greece, although Greece was definitely in that conversation. And this is actually a criticism that Varoufakis, I'm mispronouncing his name. He's a Greek economist who worked in the Syriza government in Greece. The Syriza government was sort of a far left to leftist party that won election on a platform of opposing austerity and trying to end austerity by any means necessary. And this Greek economist criticizes the European Union and Germany and the ECB and the Troika, etc., on the grounds that, basically they just lied from the start about the actual motivations for what was happening. They never went to the public and said, we want to bail out banks and tried to prevent a broader recession. They kept trying to hide it. And they didn't go to the public and say, we want to punish Greece in order to set in order to prevent the establishment of a precedent, in order to send a message to other states that are in debt, and in order to reestablish confidence in markets. That argument wasn't really made. It was said and couched in other terms. And so there was a sense then that on the part of the Greek government, and this economist in particular, that the whole Eurozone crisis and the Greek debt issue has never really been presented honestly on the part of political elites in Europe, that it's never really been broken down. I mean, the way I've broken it down is my understanding of it. I think that's a more accurate representation of what happened, but even that is subject to debate, and I'm sure there's a number of people in chat who are probably disagreeing with me on the characterization of those events. But again, this is my perspective. This is my understanding of how things happened. And so, because there's never really been a lot of honesty in terms of the political discourse vis-a-vis this issue, it's been very ambiguous and very politically disruptive. It's been very muddy. A lot of, all of the different excuses that were given to bail out banks, to take on Greek debt. Even the European Central Bank buying Greek debt was controversial. There was actually a big lawsuit over that. Well, maybe lawsuit isn't the right name, but the ECB was taken to court because technically it can't buy debt like that. It can't go out of its way to buy a single country's debt just for, again, what are basically political reasons. And so the ECB had to kind of come up with the excuse of quantitative easing. Quantitative easing was partly meant to alleviate pressure on the economy, to help stimulate the economy, but it was also a convenient excuse to buy all of this Greek debt that they didn't technically legally have grounds to buy. So there's just been a lot of political maneuvering to try to kind of hide what is fundamentally a politically unpopular move, bailing out Greece and bailing out banks. It was seen as necessary, but nobody could quite think up a good enough excuse to do it. And so they kind of hid it. And the result has been that Greece has been just in perpetual austerity ever since, and the economy hasn't recovered. But the Troika has been unwilling to bend because, again, it doesn't want to establish a precedent where countries think they can get bailed out. And but they haven't been able to kind of admit that. Instead, they say, no, it's fine. Austerity will work in the long run. This is what's best for Greece's economy, blah, blah, blah. All of that is bullshit. And everybody knows it's bullshit. The Troika knows it's bullshit. The Greek government knows it's bullshit. The whole thing is just kind of a horse and pony show to hide the fact that they're trying to discourage other states from thinking that they can get bailed out. And so that's led to an immense amount of problems, not least in Greece. Because in Greece, all they hear is, this is good for you, austerity is good for you. Obviously, it's not. And objectively, any number of economists have come out and said austerity has to end. There has to be some debt forgiveness. This whole program is insane. It's terrible for Greece. This should end. And even the IMF has come out against it, against austerity. They are for a more conciliatory approach. But again, for those political reasons, the Troika has not budged and probably will continue to not budge. But because they have not presented it in terms of those political reasons, because they do couch it in terms of this is what's economically best for Greece, Greek people feel they're being lied to, and again, they are. I think they are anyway. And so there's a sense of oppression that foreigners are kind of running the country for them and making demands of them. In fairness to the Troika, which is not a phrase you'll hear much, but in fairness to the Troika, one of the conditions placed on Greece beyond austerity was actually economic reform. They wanted any number of economic reforms to be made that not only cut government spending, but that would make the Greek economy more competitive, that would improve tax collection, that would make bureaucracy more efficient, that would make the government less corrupt, a lot of things like that. And so while the government implemented all of the austerity measures, they actually stonewalled on a lot of the economic reforms. And there's actually a lot of displeasure in the Troika, in the IMF, in the ECB, etc., about a lack of progress in terms of real deep economic reform in Greece that would actually help the economy, much more so than any amount of austerity would. So in fairness to the Troika, it's not as though the Greek government has been entirely acting in good faith over the course of this issue over the past 10 years either. Yeah, one of the reasons this is my perspective. Again, the whole issue is muddy and confusing and debatable, but one of the issues that I'm of this perspective is because of Syriza. Because there was a big debate about what would happen when Syriza got into power and confronted the Troika over this, because the Syriza was saying that if the Troika did not give them concessions, did not agree to at least alleviate austerity measures, that they would just not pay the debt back, which would have been a big scandal in Germany, because one of the only ways that the German government was able to get the public to agree to the measures taken as part of the Eurozone crisis to basically buy all of this Greek debt was that it would not cost them anything. It would not cost tax dollars. All of this debt is going to be repaid someday, so all of the money we spent buying the debt, we're going to get all of that back, so don't worry about it. So politically, it's a kind of a third rail in Germany. Nobody wants to be the one to say, all that money we spent on Greek debt, yeah, we're not getting any of that back. So knowing that, the Greek government, Syriza specifically, threatened to just not pay the debt back. Like, if you don't give us some concessions, we're just going to walk. And hypothetically, that would have also been destructive for Greece, because the Troika, of course, can basically cut off the Greek central bank from further support from the European Central Bank. Every country has its own central bank. It's just a part of a larger system of central banks, and the European Central Bank is at the top. It's the main European central bank, hence the name. But it has branches in every country, and Greece has its own that the Greek government kind of oversees. And the threat was that, okay, if you stop paying this debt, then we're just going to shut off your banking sector. And it's not like the Greek banking sector was in good shape already. The recession had taken a toll. Foreign investors had pulled money out in significant quantities because they didn't have any confidence in the Greek economy or the Greek financial sector, etc. So, yeah, it was unclear about how that would end. It was seen as kind of a standoff. And so the Syriza government went into negotiations, they hashed it out, and there was a belief on Syriza's part that the Troika would back down, because they didn't think that they would be willing to accept that. And there was also a sense that if the Greeks walked and if they were cut off from the European Central Bank, that the Greek government would then pull out of the Eurozone, that they would stop usage of the euro, readopt the drachma, their old currency, and that this could cause a chain reaction, that this could cause contagion, that financial markets could become afraid that Italy and Spain might something do similar and would devalue their debt accordingly, and that could make it a self-fulfilling prophecy, that there would then be a recession and the economies would crash, and that they would think it necessary to readopt their own currencies to try to pay down the debt. So there was a sense then that they had that trump card. The Greeks thought, okay, we have this threat of potential contagion that could bring the whole house down. So let's go in there and flash that and see what concessions we can get. But the thing is, again, the Germans didn't do that. They didn't back down. The Troika actually held their ground and said, no, we're not going to do that. And that actually surprised a lot of people. I remember reading in the press that a lot of people were of the mind, oh, the Troika is going to back down. They're not going to be willing to risk contagion. But from their perspective of Germany, etc., the greater risk would be giving in, because it establishes that moral hazard. It establishes that precedent, and it makes it inevitable that in the future they'll have an even bigger problem when Italy and Spain and other countries grow their debt and default, thinking that Germany and other countries will bail them out. So from the perspective of Germany and the Troika, the bigger risk was always in acceding, in establishing that precedent. And that to me makes their decision not to give in on austerity a lot more logical and rational. It makes sense then. It kind of explains that development, why that played out the way it did. And to be fair to the Greek economist I mentioned, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. I can't remember it. Even if I could, I probably couldn't pronounce it. But he thought he was in charge of the negotiation, and he actually went in with another trump card, which is that, again, he believed that full-on default was the only way to go, but he actually had his own government kind of pull the mat out from under him. When he went into the negotiation, he nominally had their support, but when the Troika started putting pressure on them in return, the Greek government actually caved. They didn't actually kind of really stand up and say, all right, well, we're definitely going to do this then. Once the European governments made it clear that they were not going to give ground, Greece should have acted on its threat, because it had a threat that it would, pull out of not pay the debt and spread contagion. The only way for that threat to be credible is to actually move on it. So once they, once they lost that gamble, they should have acted on it. Because again, if you're not going to get the concession, why continue austerity? And if you do start acting on it, it could signal credibility where maybe the Troika didn't think there was any before. And maybe then they would be more inclined to make concessions as a sort of last-minute, 11th hour agreement. But as soon as it became clear that they were not going to get concessions, at least in that negotiation, the Greek government backed down. Syriza backed down and told this Greek economist representative that, all right, we're not going to move forward. We're not actually going to enact this threat that we have. And so that eliminated any credibility to the threat that they brought to the negotiation, and they had no leverage at that point. And at that point, it was inevitable that austerity would continue, because the Greek government had basically sent a signal. I'm trying to speak in game theoretic terms here. They basically sent a signal that none of their threats had credibility and that all of the leverage lay with the Troika. And so there was no chance of the austerity ending at that point. I think he had this Greek economist, I'm sorry I keep referring to him as the Greek economist. He has a name, I just can't remember it. He actually has a good YouTube video because he wrote a book about this basically, and he did a good interview. And it's like an hour long or something. And in the interview, he really details a lot of this stuff from the Greek perspective. And I don't remember what the video was called or have a link or whatever, but it's out there. And I would encourage anybody interested in the issue to kind of look into that. So let's see. That's my rough summary off the top of my head from memory of the Greek debt crisis and the Eurozone crisis. And again, I'm probably missing details, and the whole issue is very debatable, so I'm sure there's, you could go back and forth on it forever. But that's my understanding of what actually happened with the Eurozone crisis and what's actually happening with the Greek debt crisis, such as it is. So could I talk about the Greek debt crisis and its implications for the European Union in the future? Well, basically, I mentioned that. Basically, there cannot be a precedent where a country thinks it can get bailed out. Otherwise, it makes a financial crisis inevitable, because they'll just keep borrowing and then it explodes and it just ends badly. And a lot of countries in the European Union, like in Germany or Eastern Europe, where there's relatively more austerity, there's more what you could call fiscal responsibility, quote unquote, in Eastern Europe than there is in certain Southern European regions, Southern European countries. And those countries in particular are very resistant to the idea of establishing this precedent for a bailout, because they've suffered a lot after the Cold War ended, when they were adjusting to a free market economy, and they had all of these structural adjustment programs, and it was all very painful because a lot of people were thrown into poverty. It was a very disruptive process, but in the long run, it kind of paid off for them to different degrees for different countries. That's a whole other conversation we could have. The feeling in Eastern Europe is that they're poor countries that have worked hard to build up their economies and maintain good fiscal responsibility, and that bailing out Southern European countries, which they perceive as profligate, is unfair to them, because they're poor countries, but they're not getting bailouts. They wouldn't want, again, they're relatively responsible, so they don't need them, but there's a sense that it's unfair that all of this money is being spent on profligate Southern Europe, while Eastern Europe remains, very responsible, but doesn't get the same sort of regard or attention. So there's a big political schism in the European Union on that count. Is it better to help out these countries and give them more room, maybe give them their own currencies again, or is it better to assert responsibility and try to incentivize fiscal responsibility there? And where you sit on that debate is kind of a function of politics. Obviously, a lot of people in Southern Europe are of the mind that government spending should be more profligate, relatively more profligate, not irresponsibly so, not unreasonably so, but they think that the austerity measures are needlessly strict and that they should be given more ambit. But then again, to reiterate, Germany, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, those countries are more opposed to that, because they see that as the result of they see the debt defaults and unsustainable levels of debt in Southern Europe as the result of political irresponsibility, irresponsible political actors, and they see it basically as a flaw in those countries' political cultures, and that it's the flaw that should be addressed, and not that the problem should be addressed with lots of injections of money. That shouldn't just be government spending as much as they want, or asking for bailouts, or getting assistance, etc. It should be those countries dealing with problems in their political culture that lead to deficits, and dealing with problems in their economy that lead to calls for more government spending. They believe that economies and government reforms should be designed in a way that makes them more competitive, rather than just increasing government spending to try to alleviate recession and slow economic growth. And there's no real agreement on that. That's not really clear. The trouble Southern Europe has is that it needs money and it doesn't have it. So naturally, they kind of need it from some other place, and that some other place is basically Germany and Central Europe. And if they don't want to pay it, they're not going to. And they don't, so it's probably not going to happen. And that gives the leverage then to Central and Eastern Europe as far as that debate goes. So the most likely outcome was always that, well, again, status quo. Again, status quo is always the safest bet. The most likely outcome was always going to be status quo, where countries don't get bailed out, and that precedent is not there. And if it had been, then Germany would have, implemented some change, or maybe even left the European Union. There's any number of things they could have done, because it would have been immensely unpopular in Germany, politically speaking. As politically unpopular as austerity is in Southern Europe, the idea of providing bailouts and assisting other countries with debt problems, that's just as unpopular in Germany. So politically speaking, it's just not viable. It's actually a little bit funny, because some people accuse Germany of trying to create sort of a German hegemony, kind of using the European Union to create a giant German hegemony where they're sort of the central power, and they take decision-making power away from other countries, and they cite the imposed austerity on Greece for being an example of that. And these people usually argue that sovereignty should be respected, that nations should be able to make their own decisions about government spending and austerity and all this kind of thing. But it's kind of an ironic argument, because the whole reason this is happening is because Germany is exerting its sovereignty. The sovereign German desire is not to spend a lot of money on this, and so they're conditioning their support on not supporting, not establishing the precedent of bailouts. So, if you want more sovereignty in Europe, well, that's great, but that's not going to look differently than what you have now. Germany is still not going to bail out countries, and you're still going to have debt problems. So it's not a problem of European federalization and creating a supersized federal European states, or rather United States of Europe, so to speak. The problem from the get-go was political differences in different countries, and that would still be a problem if you had a very decentralized European Union that put more emphasis on sovereignty over unity. So that's actually kind of the criticism of Germany trying to unify Europe and create a hegemony. It's a bit wrong-headed. I think it's a bit of an ironic argument that kind of looks at things a little bit backwards. Again, this is just my perspective, so make of it what you will. I'm no expert on this stuff. This is just my own reading and my own perspective on it, so don't take it personal. So as far as implications, I think things will continue as they are. Hopefully there won't be another debt crisis, especially not for Spain or Italy, because that would be potentially disastrous. But I think if there were, I don't think Germany would change its mind. I think there would still be a great resistance to bailing them out, and it might just lead to a schism in Europe. This is one of the big discussions in the European Union over the past few years, especially since the Eurozone crisis, is what shape the European Union should take. We talked a little bit about this last week. How should the European Union evolve going forward? Should it be ever closer union? Should it be more centralization? Should it be status quo? Or should we decentralize and make it much weaker? There's been some debate on that count, and a lot of that started with the Eurozone crisis, because there was a sense that national sovereignty was being abridged, that forced austerity was too much, that countries should have more power. And then other countries were saying, well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Well, this is more of a personal argument made at the level of individuals rather than at countries. But the opposing argument was that ever closer Europe was preferable because the European project was a good thing, a net good thing, had been a net positive for Europe, and would bring more positives if the barriers between countries would continue to erode and Europe would continue to be one polity, would continue to evolve being one polity. And generally the southern European countries pushed more the sovereignty aspect, and Eastern European countries were more the unity argument. And obviously that changes with the issue, because in terms of immigration, the Eastern Europeans are much more against unity. They're much more for sovereignty. So the sovereignty versus unity argument varies from issue to issue, which speaks to the level of self-interest that defines diplomatic interactions in the European Union. The European Union basically has a long way to go before it creates a united Europe. Their national interest still definitely takes precedent in terms of how these issues are framed and discussed in Europe. So I wouldn't worry about sovereignty disappearing, because sovereignty and sovereign relations are still the dominant framing for diplomatic interactions in Europe. But more to the point, there's this discussion about sovereignty versus unity. Germany is kind of uncomfortably in between. It wants the European project. It's, besides being good for the German economy, it's also kind of their salvation. The European project has always been kind of Germany's form of penance, in a way, for World War II. And so it's kind of a testament to their desire to reintegrate and be a part of the European family. And so for that sentimental reason, for economic reasons, for political reasons, Germany wants more unity, but it doesn't want so much unity that it loses the sovereignty to determine what it does with its budget. Like, Germany is the economic powerhouse of Europe, and anything that requires a lot of money that the European project would need almost invariably requires a German check, so to speak. And the Germans have always been a little bit uncomfortable with that. They would prefer more autonomy with regard to how German tax dollars are spent. So what's happened is the consensus, and basically what's going to happen going forward, is that there's going to be what's called a dual-track Europe. That's basically where this debate has ended. The idea is that countries that want more unity, want further centralization and more integration, can do that, but that if countries don't want to participate in that, they don't have to. So there will be basically an outer core of European Union countries that are sort of stick with the status quo, and then there's going to be an inner core of countries that continue further and further integration, and that continue the European project kind of on the same pace and track that it's been going on for the past few decades. And some countries don't like that. I think we talked about how Poland and the Polish government was kind of against it, because it was afraid that while they would be able to stay in the European Union and not participate in further integration, those countries that did participate in further integration would accrue unfair advantages because there would be fewer barriers to trade, they would have more economic power, and that they would then have disproportionate power in the decision-making process of the European Union over time. The trouble is countries that, if countries want to integrate further, that's their sovereign right. So that goes back to the sovereignty argument. If you do want more sovereignty in European affairs, what do you do when the sovereign desire of independent countries is for more integration, to sacrifice some of their sovereignty for integration? Well, you can't really argue that countries should have more sovereignty to do what they want and then say that countries can't exercise their sovereign desire to further integrate. So it's kind of a catch-22 for countries that, are not for more integration, but also don't want to be put in a position where they're at a competitive disadvantage. I don't really know how they can square that circle, and they probably won't be able to. But the political solution at this juncture is to leave them be. Like, okay, you don't want to participate, you don't have to. And you can't, but at the same time, implicit in that allowance, implicit in that concession is the statement that you can do what you want, but you can't stop us from doing further integration then. That's the trade-off. We're going to do further integration, and you can just do whatever on the outside with what you have now. And that's kind of the culmination, so to speak, of the Eurozone crisis and the debate that it caused about what the European Union is, what it should be, and what it's going to be going forward. So I guess that's kind of a tangent that gets away from the original question. The original question was Greek debt crisis, talked about that, implications, talked about that, especially given Brexit and Brexit as its own. That's a whole other conversation. And the Spanish-Catalan split, possible Spanish-Catalan split. I don't think Catalan is going to split. I don't think, again, we talked a bit about the preconditions for separatism succeeding before. The Catalan separatist movement just has none of those, so I don't think they have a chance. They can cause trouble, they can cause unrest, they can kind of continue the pressure there, but I don't think they can bring enough pressure to really change things such that they get independence, to change the track of political interaction between Madrid and the Catalan regional government. So I think status quo will continue there as well. Catalan will continue to be a part of Spain, and perhaps with the Catalan separatists continuing to protest or maybe cause what unrest they can in order to try to maintain some pressure.
One quick interjection while we're between questions and thoughts. We got a nice host from Fitzy here. He's an Overwatch streamer. I switched over to Overwatch here recently. We're doing world discussion with who we call friend codename Agent Smith. He's kind of reading and responding to questions from the chat. We usually talk about current events, world history, major wars and conflicts like World War II, the Iraq War, that sort of thing. So if you have questions related to his area of expertise, feel free to ask in the chat and those will be passed along. We do this every Sunday night for around 3 hours. I did StarCraft for about 5 hours, and then I did another 2 hours with him in the Discord, and then now for the last hour or so we're doing Overwatch. So thank you again, Fitzy, and welcome.
Cool. All people welcome.
Yep.
Let's see. So the next question, and I apologize to the person about the Greek question if I didn't satisfactorily answer that. If you want further elaboration or want something more specific, please feel free to elaborate and ask again. So the next question then was, do you think a third political party will ever take a solid hold in American politics? This question has tripped me up so much over the past few months. Every time I try to answer it, I kind of end up stumbling over myself. So I've addressed this before, but again, I don't think any of my answers have been great. I'll kind of give you a succinct version of those previous answers. Basically, no. And that's just because of the way the American political system, the electoral college, etc., is designed. It's more or less designed for a two-party system. That comes from the let me see if I can remember this right. The first past the post system, basically, where the party, it's not a proportional voting system, let's put it like that. In a proportional voting system, seats in a legislature are assigned according to the proportion of votes that different political interests win. But in the United States, we have a first past the post system where seats are assigned according to district. So there are different districts, and then in those districts, people vote on who their representative is, and then those representatives take that district's corresponding seat in the legislature. That kind of system lends itself to just two political parties. And I won't get into it too much, because again, I need to read up on this so I can have a better argument, so I can improve my argumentation, because some people complained in the past that I wasn't doing very good on that. But one of the ways that the United States deals with that, one of the saving graces, I guess, to a degree about that, is that parties are not as centralized here, so that anybody can run. So that the result of that, you can kind of see that in the variation among candidates. So there's a lot of Republicans in Congress and a lot of Democrats in Congress, but there are left and right wings of those respective parties. There's a lot of variation among them, and that variation is a manifestation of those candidates reflecting the eccentricities and unique interests of their respective areas. A Democrat in Texas is going to be a lot more pro-gun than a Democrat in California or New York or what have you. And Democrats don't win a lot of national seats in Texas, but they do win some, especially in the House of Representatives, I think, and to a lesser degree at the state level. But they do win. So there is some representation there. You could argue about whether or not it's fully representative. It's probably not as representative as a fully proportional system would be. But generally, people who advocate for a shift to a proportional voting system from first past the post, generally they want that because they have a specific political outcome in mind. They don't like the political equilibrium as it is. So they think they can shake things up and get a more favorable outcome to their preferred political preference if they were to make that change. I doubt that would happen. I think probably Congress would probably be more representative with a proportional voting system, but I doubt it would significantly change political outcomes. So I won't get I don't want to get too deep into that because my argumentation is not great, and I apologize for that. I should do better on that score. I've read about it before, but apparently not enough to really give a satisfactory answer there. So pending further reading on my part, I won't subject to you just one of my stumbling answers. But yeah, basically that's my perspective on that. I don't think a third political party will arise specifically because the political system is first past the post, and it's just difficult for third parties to operate in an environment like that. Also, third parties have a bad reputation in the United States. They're kind of seen as eccentric. Their candidates are kind of weird, and they have weird policy platforms, and they're just very specific generally. Libertarian Party, the Green Party, the Constitutional Party, all of those kind of have these very narrow, very focused on one issue type of policy platforms, and they also do a really bad job of building up what would you call them? Their networks, basically, their support bases. One of the things that makes the Republican Democratic political parties so strong is that they go out of their way to represent specific interests. They go out and they say, all right, well, there's this group that wants this or that or the other or whatever, and they kind of play to that. Third parties in the United States don't really do that. They're much more ideological. They're much more focused on principles and ideas, and that's attractive for a lot of people. But for people who have very tangible interests that they want to see represented in government, Republicans and Democrats do a much better job at catering to them. It kind of reminds me of the occupation of Iraq in a way, because in the occupation of Iraq after the Iraq War, Paul Bremer came in and was basically governor of Iraq in the immediate aftermath of the occupation, in the immediate aftermath of the war. Still not sure what to call that war, the Second Gulf War, the Iraq War, whatever that stage of the conflict was. But when he was governing the country, he had people who were in charge of implementing economic reforms. And those people, I remember this story specifically, this anecdote. A number of Iraqi businessmen came to see one of these guys who was doing the economic reform program. And they were worried about their businesses because there was a lot of chaos, there was a lot of dysfunction, and so they were saying, all right, what can you do for me? What are you going to do about this situation? And this guy was the people in charge of the economic reform effort were very free market. They were very much all about trying to create an ideal free market system for Iraq. And the guy told them, only the best of you will survive. And that's a very principled point of view. If you believe in free markets, then yeah, of course, that's a good thing. If you don't, not so much. Regardless, though, regardless, it was a very dumb thing to say politically. If you're in this country and you're occupying it and there's all these questions and doubts about the intentions of the United States, you really don't want to aggravate people. You really want to build alliances. You want to get people on their side. And so if you want to implement free market reforms, great, but don't do it in a way that alienates people politically, such that it feeds into, say, an insurgency. So that was a very ham-fisted way to implement that policy, and that it kind of reminds me of this reform. Third parties, basically, they're very idealistic and principled, but they do so in a way that kind of alienates a lot of people, that alienates a lot of interest groups, that they kind of need to get the support of in order to be viable politically in the American electorate.
One thing that I kind of see from the U.S. with politicians starting in third parties is if you as a candidate get enough momentum, a lot of times you basically choose Republican or Democrat, which party is closer to your belief system and ideology, and then you run for them because you have better chances. So Ron Paul and Rand Paul, for examples of libertarians who are Republican Party because that gives them a lot more political leeway and momentum in the sphere in the U.S.
Let me see.
We've got some saucy discussion about Israel-U.S. relations, and one thing that is pretty key to point out with the modern internet dialogue of neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism is there's a pretty muddy area where you can have a great discussion about Israel, what Israel is doing now, how the state was formed, and that sort of thing. But thinking about Israel and Jewish people as an overarching conspiracy and all these people are working together to rule the world is ridiculous. So for the current kind of sphere of U.S. politics, how big of a factor is Israel? Because it seems like something that we don't read about that often right now. We have an ally in Israel in the Middle East. We can see that they're one of the more kind of secular developed states in the region, but the extent of that influence compared to stuff like corporate influence, like what is the magnitude of influence between Israel and U.S. compared to other forces?
Yeah, we've actually addressed this before. I think it was in one of the first episodes. Israel doesn't exert as much influence on U.S. politics now. It's kind of been deteriorating over the past 20 years. It's partly that was the whole neocons Iraq episode in American history, where a lot of people became very, very skeptical of American projection of power in the Middle East and interference in the region's affairs. And a lot of people blamed Israel for that. A lot of people in the United States thought that Israeli lobbyists were pushing the government to interfere in the Middle East, and that they were partly responsible, not wholly responsible, but partly responsible for miring the United States in a series of conflicts in the region. And that's I can't remember what the name of the lobby was. It had like a very specific name, but I don't think it exerts that kind of influence now. There's been, the problem is that in Israel, politics have evolved in a way that are more partisan. So there's a big divide in Israeli politics between people who are a little softer, a little more reformist, a little less extremist. I'm not saying conservatives in Israel are extremists, but the settler movement is kind of toes the line between extremists and right wing, and they're definitely taking politics in Israel further to the right. And not everybody in Israel is comfortable with that, and that's created a lot of political division in Israel. And the result of that has there are ramifications in the United States of that schism. And what happened was basically the Jewish population in the United States that had traditionally been very pro-Israel kind of was torn about the direction Israel was taking. There were a lot of people who were, support Israel in terms of its relations with its Arab neighbors. They want the region to recognize Israel's right to exist. None of that's changed. But there's a lot of discomfort among big swaths of the pro-Israeli community here in the United States about whether the U.S. should continue to support Israel given certain policies, specifically occupation of Palestine, the settler movement, some of the things the Netanyahu administration has done. A lot of things like that are very controversial in Israel are also controversial here and has divided and weakened the pro-Israel lobby. So partly as a result of that, partly as a result of discreditation brought by the Iraq War. The Israeli lobby is not nearly so powerful in the United States now. Kind of in the same way that the Taiwan lobby isn't a thing anymore. I talked about this the last, whatever episode it was. Before there was a big Israeli lobby, the big foreign lobby in the United States was the Taiwan lobby. And everybody was afraid of the Taiwan lobby because they would accuse you of being soft on communism if you didn't support Taiwan enough. There were enough people sympathetic to Taiwan and paranoid enough about communism to really give that lobby a lot of power. But over time, their influence waned. People got, the Vietnam War got people really tired of intervening in Asian affairs. And eventually there was a sort of an entente between the United States and China after Nixon's trip, and there was kind of a de facto alliance for a while. So the Taiwan lobby kind of lost steam, and now I don't think it's even really there anymore. Nobody cares in American politics if the Taiwan lobby is upset about something. And that was not always the case. It used to be that they very much were concerned if they were upset about something, but no longer. And the Israeli lobby seems to be on a similar track. So I don't think a lot of influence anymore, really. Yeah, anti-Semitism is a weird animal. I grew up in Texas, and it's not really explicit here. I'm sure it exists somewhere in Texas, but I never saw it growing up. So it seems like such a weird group to focus on.
Yeah.
Prejudice in the United States is very much focused on race. But then there's this other group that people don't like that's a tiny minority, and they're really successful, and they integrate. It's so arbitrary. It's like the polar opposite of prejudice against African Americans. All of the things people complain about African Americans, well, racists complain about African Americans for the most part. Most of those criticisms are kind of just ignored with the Jewish community. Anti-Semitism gets supplied in the same way that it's applied to, prejudice against Jews, rather, in the United States amongst racists is applied to that community in the same way it's applied to African Americans. But the logic is completely inverted. It seems so arbitrary. It's like you just want to hate somebody just for the sake of hating somebody.
Yeah,
it's never made a lot of sense to me.
One of the things that we talked about before was the Abrahamic faiths and how Judaism and Christianity have an interesting historical relationship with each other, where Judaism came first, and then Christianity is kind of built off the back of that. The Old Testament of the Bible, actually the first several books are the Torah, so there's a direct overlap in the text that's in the holy text for Jewish religion and Christian religion. But there are some key differences in how Christianity recommends people to live versus the Jewish culture and religious way to live. And lending money and that sort of thing caused a lot of people who were Jewish culturally and religiously to be involved in the financial sector because they didn't have a lot of the same restrictions on stuff like lending money to other people. So if Christians were having their money kind of lent around by people who were Jewish, and lots of people who were Jewish were involved in the financial sector, there's the sense where some people think, oh, this is some grand conspiracy and they're trying to take over. Whereas if you think about it from the adaptive biological capacity, there's an open niche where there's resources that certain people are allowed to take that other people are, by religion or culture, prevented from taking. So people who don't have the restrictions will fill the niche. It's kind of like trees that are getting light from the sun. If there's an opening, then there are going to be leaves that'll fill that space. It's that kind of thing. So it's funny seeing the anti-Semitism get another big wave with the recent wave in neo-Nazi movement in the U.S. And Texas has quite a lot of that. I think for states in the U.S., we might be the leader or in second place for hate groups. We just have a lot of landmass. It's very easy to have a bunch of people in areas and kind of have your own ideology just on a ranch somewhere, and people aren't going to mess with you because Texas is so dang big. There's lots of room for activities. So we'll get all kinds of wild folk.
Have you seen a lot of anti-Semitism in Texas, though?
If you watch documentaries on a lot of neo-Nazi groups in Texas and just look at the raw list of how many new alt-right, far-right groups there are that do that kind of thing, they're quite numerous. And you have stuff like Aryan Brotherhood that are really big in the Texas prison system. Prison system is another breeding grounds for joining extremist groups because it gives you a level of security from other gangs that are in the prison system, where you're less likely to get beat up if you join a team. So even if in many cases, prison teams are not the most morally and ethically sound teams, they're people who have been incarcerated. So it's a place where people are very impressionable. They can join a group and have that sense of belonging. And then if you're there for years with people, you become like the people you spend time with. A lot of them will adopt those types of ideologies and get on board with those ways of thinking. But it does seem very remote, and it's less of the racist tendency, and it's more of, I think, a suspicion based on the historical differences between Jewish and Christian groups in Europe. It's so old, though. Like, for a 21st century person, it seems very silly to even have that kind of bias intact. But
a 21st century American, anyway.
Yeah.
It's a bit more of a thing in Europe. Obviously, we saw a pretty significant manifestation of that in the 1940s. So clearly some deeper roots there. But here in the United States, it's not nearly so visceral or plain, you know. Prejudice here is very much racial, and especially in Texas, there are just hardly any Jewish people here to hate. Like, what? It's irrational to me.
Yeah.
In New York City, there's a whole bunch. There's a very large Jewish community in New York City. I could see there being a lot of prejudice there. You know, larger minorities tend to attract more prejudice. So I could see maybe something happening up there in terms of anti-Semitism. But, you know, not so much in places like the South or Texas, where the community is just very small.
Well, there's an interesting aspect of how prejudice is maintained. There's an African American who has been going around to KKK communities and making friends with them. And he collects a bunch of different robes and hoods from people who stopped being part of the KKK because he was a cool guy and he was a black American and he was a human being. So if you think about it, the greater the population and interaction with the demographic, usually the more you can see that they're a human being too, that has beliefs and desires and emotions and feels pain and wants to learn and prosper in life and that sort of thing. So exposure tends to reduce prejudice as opposed to increase it. So that would kind of follow with a place with a large Jewish community. If you go to work with those people and they're your neighbors and they're good people just like you, then there isn't really any evidence to have prejudice against them. Whereas if you never interact with them at all and someone tells you that this demographic of people is less than human, they're bad and this and that, and you have no evidence to the contrary, a lot of people just will never question that belief. I was told this, and that drums up some support for me in the sense that if there's someone who's less than human, then I'm kind of relatively elevated by comparison. So they're looking for those ways to feel higher than other people by looking at demographics and saying these are lower than me.
So my question then would be, what about something like Yugoslavia, where there's a lot of exposure to the different groups, but it still led to eventual violence? Or even in the United States, you know, the African American community and white communities have been in close proximity, at least in the South, for hundreds of years, and it doesn't seem to have done a lot of good. So, I mean, how does that fit into this exposure argument? Is there some mitigating circumstance that's preventing it from taking effect there in those examples?
I would say you would have to consider what they're fighting over, basically. Is there scarcity of resource in the region? And are the groups separated enough that they compete for similar resources? Because I would say that if there's no scarcity, you're post-scarcity, everyone has food and shelter and most of them have employment, then things are basically fine and people are working alongside each other. As opposed to if there's territorial dispute, if communities are segregated and they don't really interact much, then I would say that's a way that you can be in the same state as another demographic without ever building that sort of camaraderie with them as human beings. From what I've seen, like, the most mixed place that I lived in was Atlanta, and Atlanta has a very strong black middle class. And to me, Atlanta seems very well integrated, where it's almost 50-50 population between whites and blacks, and everyone seems to be cool with it from what I can tell. And because of the success of blacks in the region, they've kind of demonstrated that if we're given the opportunity, we can do stuff too. We don't need to think of ourselves as less or be aggressive. We can do business with you too. So I'm not an expert on this topic, though. This is just kind of the stuff that I've gathered from observation and some very basic studies. So kind of the disclaimer that you give after a lot of your answers, where it's like, this wasn't my thesis. I don't know all the answers. It's just my thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I've heard arguments for both before. You know, the argument that proximity is bad, and but then I've also heard proximity is good. So, you know, it's kind of an ongoing discussion for me. It's not something that I want to read more about it, and it's just I haven't reached a conclusion on that. But it's an interesting discussion, and you've given me some interesting food for thought in that regard. I've just always thought of the old phrase. What was it? There's an old phrase in the English. Familiarity breeds contempt.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's really hard for a lot of people, and I think causes them to pick sides in a lot of capacities or to make up their mind, is sometimes we haven't figured out the answer to a broad question like that. And I think a lot of people would prefer to have a poor answer that isn't correct than to have no answer at all. Because it kind of leaves something to be desired, as opposed to if you fill the slot in your brain with, oh, this is why that happens, then you can move on to the next thing, and you can tell your friends, and there's a positive feedback loop when people are asking about something. You say, oh, well, it's like this, and then you feel like you've given them some knowledge. You feel good about yourself, as opposed to admitting ignorance, which is harder to do, especially when we value knowledge so much with so much information around.
Yeah, there is no absolute knowledge. There is no end point to knowledge. There's never a point when you can really say conclusively, all right, we know this. For sure, 100% this is the truth. That's especially true with social science and social problems like this. You know, it's very much a heuristic process of research done over time and accumulating a body of evidence, and then once you have enough, you can maybe get some consensus. But it'll always be subject to criticism, and the zeitgeist could always change as new evidence comes out. So there's, you know, knowledge is a journey, not a destination. It's about continuously learning, continuously unveiling the truth slowly over time, and then building your comprehension. But there's never a point when you have perfect knowledge, when you have full comprehension of the truth. That's almost impossible.
Would you believe it that the slogan of the stream is "Mastery is a path"? That's basically exactly what you're saying, just with a few different words.
Yeah.
Learning is a journey, mastery is a path. It's not as easy as you think.
Yeah, that's science in a nutshell. That's the nature of scientific inquiry. That's what I was taught in the PhD program while I was in it. That you can't say that you know something for sure 100%. It's always, well, there's evidence for this. We think this is true, but that's always subject to criticism, and you should always be cautious. That's one of the reasons that type 2 errors, I think, are preferred to type 1 errors, and academia is actually designed around that. I hope I'm getting this right, and I might be mixing them up. But basically, a type 1 error is when you do research and then come to a conclusion, an erroneous conclusion, and end up asserting that something is true that is actually not. So that's a type 1 error. And so then a type 2 error is when you do your research and come to an erroneous conclusion, and you end up saying that something is false when it's actually true. Now the former, saying something is true when it's actually false, is considered the greater sin. And so that's greatly discouraged. And the reason that is because when you say something is true, then people run with that. That has real world impact. People will say, all right, well, this is true, then let's go to all this bullshit. But then if you're wrong, the potential negative consequences are very large. So there's a great possibility for creating negative action with a type 1 error. In contrast with the type 2 error, to a degree you have the same potential for negative consequences, But probably the result of a type 2 error is that people don't do anything. There is inaction. And so inaction is probably going to be less destructive than action. And hence there's kind of this preference for the type 2 error. And I hope I'm remembering this correctly. I might be making an ass out of myself, but yeah, this is how I remember it. So,
well, it kind of fits with the med school saying first do no harm.
Mm-hmm.
So that indicates the order as well. So first don't assert something that's false. If you don't assert something that's true, that's not as bad as asserting a falsehood.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
So the type 2 error, much preferred there, because there's a sense that it would do less damage once it's unleashed onto the world than a type 1 error would.
Someone saying in the chat, that's the only thing I remember from statistics.
So let's see. Not sure how we got onto that. So there's that question. We got through that. Let's see. In your opinion, is the EU primarily beneficial only for the productive market, aka Mittelstadt? Did Brexit reflect the less productive societies trying to escape this economic servitude? And is it logical to expect more European nations to do the same? I have to think about this. Let's see. All right. Oh, okay. So basically, this is kind of a question from the perspective of the European Union. Is the European Union specifically beneficial only for productive societies, and for less productive societies, is it a net negative? Is it kind of a net drain on economic growth? That's kind of my inference here. And I don't think that's true. I don't think it's only beneficial for productive societies. One of the reasons countries wanted to join the European Union in the first place was because they saw benefit in it. Their economies were, it's not like Southern European economies like Italy's economy and Greece's economy. It's not like their struggles are new. That's not a new phenomena. They've been having trouble for several decades. I mean, they'd already been stagnating in the 1970s and 1980s. So there was a desire to try to do something to stimulate growth, and joining the European Union was considered to be such a stimulus because they would have more access to a larger market, right? They previously were stuck with their own nation's markets, but by creating a single large common market, they would be able to, tap more demand. They would be able to kind of sell more stuff, basically. And of course, the downside was increased competition. So hypothetically, and well, what actually happened was that a number of businesses, certain industries, etc., got competed down, if not competed out of existence, because they couldn't hack it in the single market. But while there were those firms, there were also firms that did well. There were also firms that had a competitive advantage in those countries and that were able to do all right. The trouble in Southern European economies, like, again, Spain, Greece, Italy, is not so much the debt. It's more economic policy in general. A lot of these countries have sclerotic regulatory regimes that make it difficult to start a business, make it difficult to get approval for licenses, just make it difficult in general to form a business and to carry out business. And countries like France also have heavy regulatory regimes, but still manage to be relatively economically competitive. I think France is more competitive than Spain, Greece, and Italy. France also has problems, though, in its own right. It's still not as competitive as, say, Germany, Eastern Europe, or Britain, but it does better. So, it can be done. You can have kind of a strong role for the state and have a competitive economy. You just have to calibrate it correctly. Right now, equilibrium has not been reached. The regulatory regime in these countries needs to be drawn down some, and in certain specific areas. What those areas are is a whole other discussion. Maybe we could get into that sometime, probably after I've read more about it, since I haven't read about it in years and years. But, the point is, there has to be some economic liberalization there to engender the economic growth that's needed in order to prop up a lot of these popular policies that people want. A strong welfare state, strong benefits, strong state role. what you think about that stuff is down to your subjective opinion. Obviously, people in Southern Europe are more for it. There's no reason they can't have it, just so long as they can pay for it. And if they want to pay for it, they have to generate tax revenue through economic growth. That's about the only way to do it, that they can generate enough economic growth to generate enough revenue to continue the status quo in that regard. And the big problem politicians have in those countries is that there's just so much resistance to it. There's a sense that it would be regression, that it would be a blow against certain interest groups, labor, and specifically labor groups, and certain other industries as well, I'm sure. Probably small businesses, maybe, depending on how regulations are written. It's quite possible to write regulations in a way that benefits certain people in an industry. Like big companies and corporations often benefit actually from extensive new legislation regulating their industry because it creates a barrier to entry. It makes it harder to join the market, to produce in the market and compete. And because it's harder for new entrants to come into the market, they ended up with monopolistic power because of it. There's no credible threat of a new entrant into the market undercutting them. So if they become a little bit more inefficient, if they raise their prices a bit, it's relatively less likely that a new entrant will come into the market and undersell them and take their market share. So big corporations are actually kind of for big regulations, depending on the nature of the regulations, because they do kind of benefit from them in that way. But you could also hypothetically write them in a way that benefits small businesses or labor or, anything, what have you. So some of that just needs to be loosened up so that economic actors can have more ambit, can have more free range in which to operate and generate economic growth, to undertake, whatever activity is they can think of that allows them to hire more people and produce more goods and services. And that just isn't happening. But that's the crux of the issue. And all of that stuff is hugely controversial. And, most politicians in Southern Europe on pretty much all sides agree that reform needs to happen. Economic reform needs to happen. Even the Socialist Party in France, when it was in power, made an effort at economic reform. It was kind of a half-assed effort, and it didn't go anywhere. But they recognized the need for it and at least tried. And, if even French socialists are trying to do it, clearly something needs to happen. Clearly that's a tacit admission that economic reform needs to happen and is in the cards. And sooner or later, it's inevitable. I mean, Kukio used to say, Kukio was a smart guy. He used to say to me that people will not change until the pain of remaining the same becomes too great. Mm-hmm. And once that pain reaches that critical mass, change is inevitable. So right now, things are not so painful and uncomfortable for Southern Europe and for France that they're willing to compromise on economic reform and economic liberalization. But eventually, it's going to get there. Things will only get worse until that moment comes when there's just no choice. The only alternative is to just go batshit crazy. Just to go full populist, shut down the borders, just shovel government money at specific interest groups, and try to create the illusion of recovery, an illusion that things are getting better when really you're just benefiting certain groups and trying to shut down certain others. That's a pseudo-authoritarian measure, that could work in so much as it would return a semblance of growth and stability, but it would just be a mirage. It would just be manipulation of the public sentiments, of populism, of the media, in such a way that people think they're better off when they're really not. And I would like to think that Western Europe, in particular, if not Europe in general, would be at a point where where the polities would be willing to recognize that that's not a good course to take. That's not good for the political culture. It introduces corruption into the sphere. It's going to introduce monopolies and economic inefficiencies, a lack of growth. It's going to create any number of problems. It's just going to look like it's working in the first 10, 20 years. It'll feel good, so to speak. I think a much better course would be a more reasoned reform effort. It doesn't have to be full-on shock therapy, early 90s style. I'm not advocating that, and I don't think it would be a good idea. It probably wasn't a good idea in the early 90s. But some reform needs to happen. There needs to be a shift there, in my opinion. Again, this is me talking from my perspective and from my understanding, my limited understanding. But some reform almost certainly has to happen and will happen eventually. And I would like to think the polity in Europe would prefer mild economic reform over a populist revolt. time will tell, which of those ends up being the case, but I would like to think of the latter rather than the former. So that's, how did I even get onto that? Where was is the EU primarily beneficial for productive countries? Yeah, I don't think so, because again, I think Southern Europe and the unproductive, quote-unquote, countries do see benefit in it. And even Greece doesn't want to leave the euro. If you talk to Greek people, they've made it pretty clear, whatever happens, they don't want to lose the euro. They trust the euro. That was one of the big benefits that people perceived in having the euro, especially in countries like Italy and Greece that had problems with defaulting on debt and devaluing currency. Populations don't like devaluing currencies because your savings are in your currency. And if your currency devalues 50%, well, guess what happened to your savings? You have 50% fewer savings. That's not great. And people would much prefer if their savings were more secure, and the euro gave them that security. So the euro is actually very popular amongst even people in the most euro-skeptic countries. It's given them a sense of security they never had before, and they don't really want to be subjected to the political whims of their what in many cases are corrupt political cultures that would have no qualms about devaluing a currency for political reasons or for whatever reason. So taking that power away from their national governments was kind of seen as a good thing. Whatever they might think about sovereignty and austerity and all that, the euro is preferable to the drachma, which would be subject to their politicians, and not even Greeks really like their politicians. Never really have, but especially not now, for a variety of reasons. So I do think even Southern Europeans see it as beneficial, and I think it is beneficial. I think it improves competitiveness. It gives them access to a larger market. It gives them a lot more opportunities, whatever costs it gives them. You can make a different argument about the euro, because the argument about being in the European Union is a separate argument from being in the eurozone. And that's a whole other conversation we could get into. But the European Union itself is a benefit for everybody. Everybody benefits from it. The problem is one of competitiveness, more so than unfairness. It's not so much Central Europe exploiting the rest of Europe for its own benefit. They're just more competitive. The assumption in the mid-90s, I think anyway, if I'm remembering this correctly, but I believe the assumption in the early mid-90s was that they recognized that there were differences in competitiveness between countries in the I think it was called the European Economic Community at that time, before it became the European Union. Everybody recognized that. I think what they expected was that as the less competitive countries suffered from their lack of competition, then naturally there would be a demand for reform. Naturally there would be a political demand amongst their polities for measures economic reforms that made them more competitive. And so in that way, there would be a shift towards a natural equilibrium in which everybody was more or less equally competitive and had more or less the same economic reforms in place. And that obviously definitely did not happen. And I think that really surprised everybody. I think, it surprised the people who in Central Europe and the wealthier parts of the European Union who really thought that's what would happen. They really thought there would be a convergence in prosperity and competitiveness over time. And political cultures in certain countries were very resistant to that and ended up kind of stopping the process. Maybe it was never a realistic expectation to begin with from a political perspective, but that's kind of what they were hoping. It was very much an optimistic time in the mid-90s. People kind of were seeing the best, hoping for the best, and, predicting the best, and there was a feeling of optimism that it was, surely this will work out. There are some problems, but yeah, they'll definitely converge, surely. And it just didn't work out that way. And so now there has to be this discussion that probably should have happened from the start about, all right, well, what should a single market look like? What do you do with countries that have different levels of economic competitiveness? Do you give them their own currencies? Do you give them special privileges so that they can kind of implement some barriers to trade to protect their market, their producers, so that to kind of make up for the lack of competitiveness? Like, what do you do? Just how do you manage that? There has to be some agreement on what to do there, and there really hasn't been. And there's, again, we talked before about how there's agreement on the two-speed Europe, but there's still no agreement on what to do about the economic differences. Like, nobody has a good solution to that. Right now, it seems to be autopilot, just status quo. We keep coming back to status quo. Status quo is always the easiest thing. So, there are some countries, especially Southern European countries, that probably do want some change, that would probably prefer preferential treatment of some kind. but I don't think they're going to get it. I don't think the wealthier countries would give that concession. And those wealthier countries have the trump card. They have the leverage because they can shut them out of their markets. If Italy and Spain put up barriers to try to protect their producers, then Germany and France and whomever can just shut them out of their markets. And whatever gain Spain and Italy would then gain to their producers from those barriers to trade, from those protections, they would almost certainly lose more from being locked out of the larger market. And that's to say nothing of the immense amount of economic instability that would create, and then in turn the political instability. And it's not as though Europe needs more political instability at this point. So that's what I think of it anyway. That's my perspective. I would want, if I were to give a better, fully informed answer, I would probably have more data, and I would want to look at that before I gave a more committed answer than that. But in lieu of that, I can just give my opinion, and that's pretty much where I stand on it. That's my perspective. That's, from what I understand of it, that's how I see it. What was that? I keep losing track of that. Okay, so that was the first part of the question. And is it logical to expect more European nations to do the same vis-a-vis Brexit, to leave the European Union? I don't think Brexit was an example of a less productive society leaving the European Union, because Britain is actually probably one of the most productive societies in the European Union. They're definitely highly ranked. I don't know if they rank higher than Germany, but surely they rank almost higher than most any other country there. Brexit was much more a manifestation of domestic British politics. I mean, immigration was like the big issue there, as well as an overarching sense of disenchantment, the political elites of both parties, and that that's kind of stemmed from the economic dislocation caused by structural changes. The sort of collapse in the traditional industrial economy, such as it was. When I say collapse, I don't mean it disappeared. I mean it just changed. It just got automated. It got outsourced. So there's still very strong British industry, just like there's still strong American industry. Just it doesn't employ nearly as many people. It does not constitute the core of communities like it used to. And those communities have suffered as a result, and nobody really knows who to blame for that or what to do about it. There doesn't seem to be any good solutions to helping such communities that have imploded in that way from those structural changes. And that manifests as discontent in places like, well, Britain and the United States in particular, where there's a lot more competition economically. And that competition can be cutthroat, and that can be good in the sense that it pushes people to strive for more, to create more, to produce more goods and services, but it's also a lot more stressful. People don't always react to that stress if opportunities narrow to the point where they don't think they can make it. So I don't think there will be more Brexits in the European Union. I don't think more countries will see that as a good course of action, not least because the European Union, especially Germany and France, are going out of their way to kind of make Brexit difficult for Britain. They're not sabotaging the talks per se, but they've definitely taken a very hard position. They're taking a perspective that we're going to get the most we can out of this deal. We're not going to just give you what you want. We're going to pursue our interests. And they want to make it clear that if you want to leave the European Union, fine, but there will be consequences. Like, we're not going to just let you have anything you want and any kind of relationship with the European Union you want. You're going to have to give some concessions in order to get some concessions. And I'm sure certain British people would argue that the European Union has not given any concessions. To a degree, that's true, but they have the leverage, so they can afford to do that. That it was obvious going into the Brexit negotiations that the European Union kind of held the better cards, had the high ground. Had the single market. However important the British economy and market might be to certain industries in Europe, the European single market is just way larger. So invariably, they just have the leverage there. Their British industries are more dependent, relatively speaking, on the single market than any industry in Europe is on the British market. And again, if anybody knows better, if somebody has, if I'm wrong on that, then please tell me in chat. Please put that there. But as far as I know, yeah, the European economy is just much more important. So invariably, Britain was at the disadvantage there, and I don't know that they ever really had a strategy for dealing with that. I don't know really that the political establishment in Britain ever had a strategy for Brexit to begin with. I think they really thought that the Remain campaign would win the referendum and they just wouldn't have to worry about it. So they're just sort of in a state of shock. They've been in a state of shock ever since almost. They just seem kind of paralyzed by what to do about it, and nobody really quite knows what to do. Yeah, Brexit is, that's a whole nother topic of discussion though, so I won't get too into that any more than I already have. But suffice to say, yeah, the European Union is making that difficult, and it's kind of setting an example, almost kind of the same way they did with Greece. They wanted to make Greece an example so that bailouts would not have a precedent. In the same way, they want to make sure that other countries don't think leaving the European Union would be too easy, in order to prevent a cascade of countries who maybe have issues with the European Union leaving the European Union and throwing the whole European project into doubt. So I don't think other countries will do the same, really. They're afraid of the wrath of the European Union, and they like the benefits too much. There are a lot of benefits. Again, there's a lot of benefits to being in the European Union, and most countries are kind of willing to compromise on that. And I don't think Britain left because of economic reasons. I think it really was just social reasons and political reasons and that kind of thing. Again, whole other topic of discussion. That's a whole other thing we could get into. Let's see. I haven't been following the news at all, really, so I'm speak out of a position of ignorance. Question: battles for resources are going to become more and more common in the future. Do you see any strategy by which the international community can effectively allocate resources to reduce conflict? Oh, that's a very political question, though. I mean, whenever you get into allocation of resources, that invariably becomes mired in political preferences and social preferences. Everybody has their priorities and ideals about what that would look like. Some people still advocate, a centrally planned economy where, the state decides who's most deserving and distributes resources accordingly. Other people go full anarcho-capitalism and just want no central authorities of any kind, and just people kind of work it out amongst themselves. And then there's the whole gamut of, economic systems in between. So whenever you talk about how best to distribute resources, global resources, that's the argument that comes to mind. Just this impossible argument between all these different competing ideologies. I think any effort to create a single system of allocation to deal with resource scarcity would run into that problem, which is why I think there will never be a global policy. There will never be a world policy regarding resource allocation in that regard. I doubt it anyway. And more likely it'll just continue being, again, for the umpteenth time tonight, status quo is the most likely outcome. Most likely it'll continue to be a free market system. And the free market system can absorb resource scarcity. It just deals with it in terms of higher prices, and then whoever is the highest bidder kind of gets them.
The most comfortable move is to remain seated.
Exactly. So that system is not the best for equity, and a lot of people have criticized it in the past. There's a whole slew of criticisms you can make of it, but the advantages it has is that it's already here. There's already institutions in place to prop it up. You don't have to change anything. And of course, those countries and regions and industries and entities and whomever who already benefit from that system are, unsurprisingly, they're going to be opposed to changing it. So not only does the system have momentum on its side, just the fact that it's already here, it also has the predetermined support of all of the countries that innately benefit from it and would benefit from it in the future. Most likely those countries that would want more equitable allocation of resources would probably want some different economic system. But those countries are probably also much poorer and much less powerful, will probably not be able to leverage, probably would not have enough leverage in any negotiation to impose any kind of change. So I doubt there would be any change there. Battles for resources will become more common in the future, probably, but it's going to depend on the resources, and it's going to depend on technology as well, because technology can change such that we're more efficient with our resources, such that demand doesn't necessarily have to dramatically increase. There won't necessarily be dramatic, well, demand will almost certainly go up, but there won't necessarily be dramatic shortages because we can become more efficient with the resources we have. That doesn't mean they won't be more scarce in the future, and it doesn't mean they won't be so scarce in the future that there won't be conflict over them. But the conflicts might not be as bad because technology mitigates them. And it could be that technology could be the solution. It could be that whatever compromises are reached over scarcity of resources involves investment in technologies of one sort or another. Or maybe not even that. Maybe just countries get together and, one country says they want a resource, they threaten to fight over it, and then the two countries that are potentially fighting over the resource recognize the power disparity between them and reach some kind of negotiated settlement. You know, war fundamentally is a failure. It's what happens when diplomacy falls apart. So hypothetically, if countries in the future are smart, if we do reach a kind of Hobbesian state where it's just countries raw competing for power, that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a lot of conflict, violent conflict. Because again, as people who are very realist, you know, this is the realist school of thought in international relations, as they'll point out, realist systems, a Hobbesian state can be very stable if there's a balance of terror. If everybody knows how powerful every other actor is in the game, so to speak, in the game space, then countries that are stronger have no reason, or rather countries that are weaker have no reason to ever get into a conflict with a country that's stronger. And they have every incentive to try to get into alliances with stronger countries. So you could end up with a series of alliance systems that create a balance of terror such that there is not any conflict. And resources end up getting distributed according to those alliance systems, depending on how they're constructed. That's also possible. So you could end up with a very stable system that is built on very relatively unstable ground, so to speak, a kind of Hobbesian state of alliance systems. Oh, are we out of time?
Yeah. You could wrap up with a little bit of stuff if there were any things you wanted to touch on.
Okay, thank you very much for just giving a quick thank you to Dorak here for helping out.
Dorak the generous and helpful. Or merciless.
Much appreciated. Much appreciated. I guess the one thing to end on is just some of the, well, we didn't talk about Zimbabwe. I kept expecting it to come up and nobody brought it up. There was a coup in Zimbabwe. I thought that was pretty big news, but I guess that just serves to serves as an example of what I keep saying. You know, nobody cares about Africa.
So Zimbabwe in 15 minutes or less. How did it go? What happened?
Quick and dirty. You know, basically Robert Mugabe, who was the dictator more or less of Zimbabwe, there's a succession crisis. He's 90 years old. He's not going to last a whole lot longer. So they need to. There was a question about who his successor would be, and there was a lot of political maneuvering in his political party about who that would be. It was looking like it might be basically the chief of internal security. This guy named Manang. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. Somebody. There's this guy who was basically the Secretary of the Interior, and he was kind of up for it. But he was in a competition with Robert Mugabe's wife, Grace Mugabe. And it was looking like Grace was going to win. And, you know, it was tensions rose sufficiently that Mugabe actually removed the Secretary of the Interior, again, whoever he was. And he actually left the country, and that upset a lot of people. Because he was this guy, the Secretary of the Interior, had been a veteran of Zimbabwe's War of Independence back in the day. And that was, you know, very kind of controversial amongst veterans. A lot of veterans associations and other veterans of the conflict really supported that guy over and above Grace Mugabe. And so the head of the army kind of came in after it happened and said, you know, we might have to step in and stop this purge of people who have a background in the Liberation Army. Basically, they perceived a kind of purge of veterans from the political party in favor of political cronies of Mugabe. And it's not as though the army and, you know, other figures aren't also kind of in bed with Mugabe and a part of the same corrupt system, but there was a sense that they were being kind of sidelined. And so Mugabe basically said, you can't do that, go to hell. And so then the army launched a coup, perhaps somewhat predictably. It surprised me. That really doesn't speak to Mugabe's political skills. You'd think someone who's been in power for several decades would have more political finesse than that, but apparently not, because the army's in control now, and they're putting a lot of pressure on him to resign. They don't want to kick him out. Sorry, what?
They called his bluff.
Yeah, they did. And it didn't work for him. So they don't want to kill him, they don't want to exile him, because he is kind of this revered figure. He was one of the leaders of the independence movement in the 1970s. And so, you know, he has status. But they really want him to resign, just willingly, voluntarily. You know, they're kind of in discussions with the opposition, with Mugabe, with the political party, etc. And there's no shortage of people in Zimbabwe who don't like Mugabe, because he is a dictator, he has monopolized broad swaths of the economy. He basically destroyed the economy with the whole farms acquisition thing in the early aughts around there. That's a whole other discussion we could get into. I guess we don't really have enough time to kind of go into the history of Zimbabwe, so we'll save that for next week if anybody cares. But for now, just know that Mugabe kind of played his cards very badly, and the army launched a coup and is trying to kind of gently push him out, kind of show, all right, we've got the power, we've got all the cards, we would like you to just kind of gracefully leave the political scene. The trouble is, Robert Mugabe has never been a particularly graceful person. And he's resisting that. He's actually saying, no, I'm the constitutional leader, this coup is unconstitutional, I'm not going anywhere, and I'm going to stay in power. And oh my god, he's really making them choose. He's really kind of putting them in a position where, all right, do we just kill him? You know, we don't really want to, but he doesn't seem to recognize that he doesn't have any leverage here. And you know, in a game theory, you know, a rational actor would just bow out and say, all right, I lost, fine. But he's really going all out. He's really pushing his luck hard. I don't think they'll kill him, but you know, if he doesn't leave voluntarily, they're going to find some way to get rid of him. His political party has already removed him as leader. ZANU-PF, I think it's called. Sort of the Liberation Movement political party. They've already voted him out. So he's not ahead of the party, but he's still president. He's still in charge of the executive branch. So the next thing that could happen if he doesn't leave, and you know, his political coalition is already falling apart because everybody recognizes, all right, the army's in charge, change is coming, and political coalitions are changing accordingly. But just Mugabe is so recalcitrant. So the next thing they can do is his political party, which controls the government, they can just impeach him. They can just say, all right, we're going to vote to just remove you from power. So then it would be constitutional. You know, the African Union and, you know, Zimbabwe's neighbors are all complaining, all right, whatever you do with Mugabe, because not everybody likes Mugabe or necessarily cares, but everybody cares about stability on the continent. So they're all saying, whatever you do, just do it constitutionally. At least nominally do it legally. So they're doing that. So they want to do it like that with the impeachment process if he doesn't stand down. That could work, but he could still cause trouble once they kick him out. Because, you know, again, they're not going to kill him, I don't think. So he could still run around and just mouth off and generally cause trouble for everybody. So he may end up under house arrest, you know, Aung Suu Kyi style. And he may end up being silenced in that way for what remains of his life. And, you know, who knows what'll happen to his wife, Grace Mugabe. She obviously, I don't know what she did. She's been in the news for the wrong reasons over the past couple weeks. I think she like beat up on somebody in another country and had to sneak out so she didn't get arrested. So there may be some problems there as far as her personality and in terms of her political acumen. I don't know what'll happen to her because she clearly doesn't have enough allies in the government and in Zimbabwe to protect her political position. Moving on, Robert Mugabe is a big deal in Zimbabwe. He's been a big figure in Africa generally for a long time, so this is big news there. You know, this could augur good things for Zimbabwe. You know, maybe it descends into chaos again, and this is a good way to end it. Again, most likely outcome, status quo. Probably just more corruption, continued ZANU-PF dominance of the political system, and maybe just some limited reforms as a result of the removal of Mugabe and his political network.
Sweet. Well, I think hearing about Africa is awesome. I really enjoy watching documentaries on it too, because there's the odd mixture of them accelerating really fast relative to the West and the East and that sort of thing, but also dealing with a lot of stuff that we don't have to deal with. So the whole industry involving our garbage ending up in Africa and them having industries around that and trying to create infrastructure and all this sort of thing. But like we've talked about, Nigeria being one of the really big rising powers in the world and what their development is like, I think it's really cool. We do have some African viewership. I know we have quite a few South African, and then I think a few Egyptian I've seen in the chat. But it's always cool. I think it's very refreshing to see something about places that are very far from home.
Yeah, you know, people should pay more attention to Africa. I don't mean to belittle Africa, saying that nobody cares about it, but that's observing political discourse in Europe and North America, where I live, and a lot of places in the Western world, just Africa is just not on the radar. Just it doesn't come up at all, and when it does come up, it doesn't seem to stick around very long. There just seems to be a broad disinterest in the continent. But like you say, the economy in Africa is growing a lot, and it's going to be a much more important place in the future. So it really behooves people to kind of pay more attention to it.
Yeah, and our audience isn't perfectly representative of the world's population. It kind of relates to access to internet infrastructure and a good enough computer rig to run Overwatch, StarCraft, and Dota and the other games that I play and stuff. So
yeah,
if we looked at the world map of the subscribers of the Neuro stream, it's very heavy in the US, Western Europe. We've got some kind of Middle East representation as well. One of my main students is from Israel. And then some in South Korea, but almost none in China, and a few Japanese, but I guess I should say Australians. We have loads of Australians who watch the stream.
Cool.
Yeah. Australia has a very, very kind of disproportionately strong and tight-knit StarCraft community relative to other countries of similar population. Yeah. Australia and Canada are kind of two of the big ones for that.
Huh. Is there any particular reason for that?
I'm not sure why. I think Australia has done a really good job of creating a lot of local events, and the population is pretty heavily concentrated around Sydney, from what I understand. So for a lot of those people, it's fairly straightforward to get to events. Canada, to contrast, is a little bit more spread out across the US border, but yeah, I don't know, the history of Australian esports. We have the fun relationship where if an Australian player plays against a North American, or really anyone from the Western Hemisphere, someone's going to have 200 plus ping. So it's kind of like, I love you Australian, but someone's going to get the bad end of the coin toss. We can't play on a Hawaii server, as much as that would be awesome.
Yeah, unfortunate. Dorak challenged me to do 2 minutes or less for a plague in Madagascar. That's easy. I don't know anything about it. Done. I haven't heard about a plague in Madagascar. I guess that just speaks to the lack of coverage of Africa. That's the first I'd heard of it. But thank you for letting me know. I'm curious now. I do know there was. I guess it wasn't an outbreak, but there was a big scare in Malawi a couple weeks ago about vampires.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, there was some rumors going around that people were like drinking blood or eating people, and so there was actually a big vampire scare in Malawi. I do remember reading about that.
Well, cool.
I don't know much more about it, unfortunately.
Well, you might not know about plagues, but you know about vampires. That's close enough. There was some funny stuff on zombies. So zombies in the Caribbean and stuff, a lot of voodoo business where they effectively poison someone so well that they appear dead for a day or two, and then you dig them up, and because they've been underground and unconscious, a lot of times they've sustained brain damage, which puts them kind of in the zombie state where they can't do a lot of their same stuff, but they're still alive. And that kind of built into the lore of the creature that we know and love from films and video games. We've shot plenty of those together in Left 4 Dead. Lots of different kinds of zombies.
Dorak is telling me that the plague outbreak is bubonic plague in Madagascar. First I'd heard of it. Yeah, there's actually still some bubonic plague in China, kind of in the interior of the country. Some of that is just historical or lack of development. The interior of China hasn't really developed at the same pace as the rest of China. Some of it is because the Japanese were assholes in World War II. They actually dropped bombs full of these plague-infected fleas and whatnot onto, free Chinese territory, purposely in order to try to cause a plague outbreak, which did happen. So it might be some remnants of that as well. Yeah, plague's still around, unfortunately.
Cool. Well, we'll wrap it up here. Thanks again for being on. If you missed some or all of this discussion and broadcast, it'll be on YouTube tomorrow. We should be back on next Sunday. Let me see. Yeah, next Sunday will be the 26th. I don't think I have any major plans. We'll be making some Thanksgiving meal this Thursday. And then the next time that I'll probably take some time off is December 9th and 10th. But the next 2 weeks we should be good to go. Great having you on. Always nice hanging out and talk with you.
Yep. Well, thanks for having me.
I hope you have a supremely awesome week.
Yeah, you too, man.
See us. Nice. And thank you, Dorak. Dorak the Helpful. I saw B2 the Rye meme with all the different titles. The most recent is Dorak the Knowledgeable. Awesome. Thank you, Agent Smith. Thank you, Agent Smith. So who